Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into the hidden world of a man whose name alone made seasoned killers hesitate. A man who ruled not with speeches, not with headlines, but with a reputation so violent, so precise, that even the Mafia feared him, Anthony Casso. To the public, he was invisible. No celebrity status, no flashy interviews, no tabloid lifestyle. Just another face in the crowd of New York City, forgettable, ordinary, unnoticed. But behind that quiet anonymity lived something far darker. Contract killers took his orders without hesitation. Veteran mobsters avoided crossing him. And when his name surfaced in a conversation, voices dropped automatically. Anthony Casso wasn't the loudest man in the room. He wasn't the richest. He wasn't the most famous. But many inside the underworld believed he was the most dangerous because his violence wasn't reckless. It was calculated. Tonight, we'll trace the rise of a man who turned murder into a business, the alliances that made him untouchable, the betrayals that nearly destroyed him, and how fear followed him long after power faded. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me which country you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's powerful seeing this late-night true crime family spread across the world. Now settle in, let the day fade, and follow me into the brutal shadow of the most feared enforcer in New York. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Learned Violence Before Power. Long before Anthony Casso became a name whispered in fear, before bodies began to appear without warning, before entire crews learned to obey without question, he was just a boy growing up in a world where violence was not the exception. It was the language. Casso was born into an environment where masculinity was measured not by patience, but by dominance. Not by empathy, but by survival. The streets around him were crowded, loud, aggressive, shaped by poverty, territorial tension, and the constant hum of unspoken danger. Here, weakness was expensive, and fear was currencyed as a child. Anthony learned early that softness invited exploitation. Arguments were settled with fists. Respect was taken, not given. And watching older men command space through intimidation taught him a lesson that would define his entire life. Power belonged to the most feared person in the room. While other boys dreamed of escaping the streets, Anthony learned how to control them. School never held much interest for him, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the classroom offered no immediate authority. The streets did. They rewarded decisiveness. They rewarded aggression. They offered instant consequence. And Anthony was a fast learner. By his teenage years, he had already developed the emotional profile that would later terrify even veteran criminals. He showed almost no visible fear. He did not hesitate under pressure. And he did not express guilt in the way most people do. This wasn't bravado. It was temperament. Witnesses from his youth later recalled that he had a cold steadiness about him. Not loud, not hyperactive, but intensely focused. When conflicts erupted, Anthony didn't explode emotionally, he observed first. And observation makes violence far more dangerous. That small-time crime soon followed. Theft, street-level hustling, enforcing minor debts. He learned which men folded quickly under pressure, and which ones needed to be broken slowly. What separated Anthony from other young street criminals was not just cruelty. It was discipline. He didn't fight for ego, he fought for leverage. He didn't hurt impulsively. He hurt with intent. By the time he crossed paths with men connected to the Lucchese crime family, Anthony had already established a reputation as someone who did not hesitate when violence was required. For the Mafia, that trait was not repulsive. It was valuable, because organized crime does not rise on charm alone. It rises on men willing to carry out instructions that others cannot stomach. Anthony was one of those men, and the system recognized him. First, he was not handed power. He was handed tests, intimidations that needed to be silent, messages that needed to be permanent, debts that required more than threats. Every time, Anthony delivered, not loudly, not emotionally, but thoroughly. He didn't just scare people. He convinced them that resistance was temporary and fear was sustainable. This is where the psychological transformation truly began. Violence stopped being an act for Anthony. It became a tool. A procedure, something you apply with precision, not emotion. By the time most men are learning restraint, Anthony was perfecting escalation. He learned exactly when to apply pressure and exactly when to make an example. And somewhere in that transition, from street criminal to calculated enforcer, something inside him settled into permanence. He no longer experienced violence as conflict, he experienced it as resolution. That distinction would eventually make him one of the most feared men in New York, but at this stage, he was still rising, still learning, still preparing for a role far darker than anything his childhood streets could have imagined, because soon, Anthony Casso would no longer be just another criminal, he would become the man others sent when fear itself needed to be enforced. Anthony Casso's true entrance into organized crime did not begin with a glamorous invitation, it began with utility. The men watching him did not see a future boss. They saw a solution. By his early 20s, Anthony was already known as someone who could be relied upon when intimidation alone failed. When a situation demanded more than threats, when someone needed to be psychologically broken into cooperation, his name surfaced. Quietly, no announcements, no public introductions. Just a phone call, a meeting, a target. His earliest confirmed assignments were not murders. They were demonstrations, messages delivered through bruises that lasted too long, warnings carved into property, not people, debts enforced with silence rather than spectacle. The goal was never headlines. The goal was compliance. This is where Anthony's personality began to fully align with the needs of the Mafia. The men above him did not want unpredictable violence. They wanted controlled fear. And Anthony delivered exactly that. By the time he became formally associated with the Lucchese crime family, his reputation was already circulating among crew leaders as someone who went too far. Not emotionally, but methodically. He did not lose control during violence, he entered control. This made him different from most street enforcers, who rely on rage, ego, or impulsiveness. Anthony relied on calm, and calm, when paired with brutality, is what truly terrifies people. His first confirmed act of serious violence came during a debt dispute involving a small but connected operator who believed his political ties would protect him. The man refused to pay. He boasted. He delayed. Anthony was sent not to kill him, he was sent to convince him. What followed was not public. There were no witnesses to no police reports, no visible crime scene. But within 48 hours, the man paid in full, and he never delayed another payment again. Those who knew what had happened later described something chilling. The man was not just injured, he was changed. His posture shifted. His speech softened. His confidence vanished. Fear had relocated from the idea of the Mafia to the memory of Anthony. This reaction was noticed immediately by those in power. Fear that remains attached to an organization fades with time. Fear attached to a person does not. And this is when his role changed. Anthony stopped being sent only when enforcement failed. Soon, he was being sent first. His presence alone began to replace the need for follow-up violence. People complied before things had to escalate. Not because Anthony was present, but because they knew he could be. Over time, this created a reputation that grew beyond his rank. Men twice his age deferred to him. Veteran criminals avoided provoking him. And younger hitters studied him with a mixture of admiration and terror. But Anthony did not enjoy this reputation in the way others might. He did not brag. He did not display status. He did not posture in social circles. His power did not come from attention. It came from anticipation. People feared what he might do, not what he had already done. And that is a far more durable form of control. As trust in his effectiveness grew, so did the severity of his assignments. Disputes that involved large sums of money. Internal problems between crews, situations where embarrassment alone was no longer enough. Anthony was being groomed for something darker than intimidation. He was being groomed for finality. This shift did not happen all at once. First, it was subtle. A situation where someone wasn't supposed to make it. A problem that needed to be removed permanently. A risk that could no longer be tolerated. Anthony never questioned the language, because by now, violence was no longer emotional to him. It was procedural. Each assignment refined his precision. Each success reduced the need for explanation. Each whispered story spread farther than any public execution ever could. And somewhere in this transition, a line was crossed. Anthony Casso was no longer just enforcing decisions that he was beginning to shape them. But the man who would truly unlock the full scope of his power had not yet entered the picture. That man would not just use Anthony's fear, he would amplify it. And together, they would become one of the most lethal partnerships in New York's underworld history. Anthony Casso did not become a killer on his own, he became one through alignment. By the late 1970s, his reputation had grown far beyond street-level enforcement. Crew leaders trusted him, debtors feared him, and whispers about his precision traveled upward through the hierarchy of the Lucchese crime family. That is when his path intersected with a man who would change everything. Vic Amuso, where Anthony was discipline and violence, Amuso was ambition and power. Amuso didn't need another enforcer, he needed someone willing to do what most men hesitated to do: remove problems without emotion. The partnership formed quietly, without ceremony, to no public declaration, that no visible elevation, just a series of instructions and a series of results. At first, the assignments were still framed as enforcement. A man refusing to fall in line, a rival crew creating instability, and internal voice growing too loud. Anthony listened, then acted, and this time, the outcomes did not leave survivors. His first confirmed kill under this new arrangement was not impulsive. It was approved. A man who had become a liability, too unpredictable, too visible, too willing to challenge internal discipline. For months, the situation had been deliberated. The decision was not rushed. Then the call came, not framed as an order, framed as a necessity. Anthony carried it out without hesitation. No spectacled, no public scene, no dramatic aftermath. The man vanished from the criminal ecosystem, and something shifted permanently. From that moment on, Anthony was no longer viewed as a man who frightened people into obedience, that he became a man who ended things. This changed how others interacted with him. Before, men negotiated. After, men complied. And in the criminal underworld, that transition is irreversible. Each subsequent assignment moved with the same precision. People who threatened profits. People who destabilized alliances. People whose presence created friction too loud to ignore. Anthony did not pursue them emotionally, he processed them. This is where his psychology fully separated from most other killers. He did not hunt because he enjoyed it, that he hunted because it solved problems conclusively. Fear that can be negotiated fades. Fear that removes its object does not. As his kill count rose, so did his insulation. The fewer people who survived contact with him, the fewer people were willing to challenge the structure that protected him, and the structure began to depend on him. By the early 1980s, Anthony Casso was no longer just executing decisions, he was consulted before decisions were made, because once a problem reached him, there was no return. This partnership with Vic Amuso transformed the internal culture of the Lucchese family. Disputes that once would have been mediated now ended in erasure. Suspicion began to carry fatal weight. Internal paranoia spread through upper ranks. What had once been a crime family governed by negotiation was becoming something far darker. A system ruled by preemptive fear. Anthony had crossed the final threshold, from intimidating men to removing them. And that meant only one thing. The volume of blood around him would never truly decrease again, that it would only grow quieter. Chapter 2. When murder became the system. By the early 1980s, the meaning of violence inside the Lucchese family had changed. Once, murder had been a last resort, a response to betrayal, a punishment for disobedience. Now, under the combined rise of Anthony Casso and Vic Amuso, murder was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming maintenance. The family no longer waited for proof of betrayal. Suspicion alone was enough. A raised voice in a meeting. A delayed payment. A rumor that could not be traced back to its source. Any one of these could place a man's life in immediate danger. And no one enforced this new reality more efficiently than Casso. That he no longer acted as a man sent to clean up isolated problems. He now supervised the structure of violence itself. Surveillance teams reported to him. Gunmen waited for his scheduling. Drivers followed his routes without asking questions. He did not merely pull triggers, he organized the world in which triggers were pulled. Inside New York City, the psychological atmosphere of the underworld began to rot from the inside. Men who had spent decades inside organized crime said they had never experienced fear like this. Not because violence was new, but because uncertainty was new. No one knew what would get them killed anymore, that a man could follow orders his entire life and still be eliminated because someone else believed he had become a risk. Long friendships no longer meant protection. Rank no longer meant safety. Everyone became temporary. Casso understood how to exploit this better than anyone, that he understood that people behave differently when they believe survival depends on remaining invisible. Voices lower. Gatherings shrink. Conversations become stripped of meaning. And in that silence, authority becomes absolute. The killings increased in frequency, not in noise. There were no public spectacles, no warnings left in the street, no dramatic declarations. Men simply failed to arrive home. 1 month, they were captains. The next month, no one spoke their names. For many of these deaths, there was no paper trail. No witnesses willing to testify. No bodies that could be definitively tied back to a crime scene. The evidence vanished as completely as the men themselves. Inside the family, this created a dangerous illusion. It made Casso seem invincible. No one saw him investigated. No one saw him questioned. No one saw him hesitate. He appeared immune to consequence. And that illusion deepened his control. Men stopped resisting, not because orders were explained, but because explanation felt pointless. The outcome felt inevitable. Those closest to him began to notice something even more unsettling. Casso was no longer reacting to threats, he was preempting them. If a man had too many friends, he became suspect. If a man limited his social circle too tightly, he became suspect. If a man earned too quickly, he became suspect. If a man slowed down, he became suspect. There was no correct posture for survival anymore. Only delay. Some tried to flee the city quietly. Their apartment doors were found unlocked days later. Cars abandoned. Jobs unclaimed. Others attempted to transfer allegiance to rival families. Most were intercepted before negotiations could finalize. A few considered law enforcement. And once that thought entered the bloodstream of the organization, paranoia became lethal. At this stage, Casso's violence was no longer merely operational. It was ideological. It communicated a belief system rooted in elimination rather than correction. Men were no longer taught lessons. They were erased. And the erasure was meant to be quiet enough that it could happen again tomorrow without resistance. For years, this system appeared to work. Money continued to flow. Operations remained profitable, and fear kept mouths shut. But fear, when applied constantly, produces a hidden effect. It does not just control behavior. It eventually destroys trust itself. And once trust collapses inside an organization built on secrecy, the collapse does not begin with rivals. It begins with defection. By the middle of the decade, the internal atmosphere inside the Lucchese crime family had shifted from discipline to dread. Meetings that once carried structure now felt like tests. Men chose their seats carefully. They watched who arrived first, who arrived last, who avoided eye contact, who looked too relaxed. Every detail felt dangerous. Anthony Casso did not need to speak loudly anymore. His presence had become symbolic. When he entered a room, posture shifted automatically. Conversations slowed. Jokes died mid-sentence. Fear had become reflexive, but there is a limit to how long human beings can operate under constant existential threat before the mind begins to look for escape routes, not criminal ones, survival ones. One of the most dangerous truths of absolute fear is this: it eventually makes loyalty feel irrational. Men inside the family began to reach the same realization independently. No amount of obedience guaranteed safety. No amount of profit guaranteed protection. No amount of history guaranteed survival. And once that realization forms, the internal logic of organized crime begins to collapse. Some men tried to disappear on their own. They sold what they could quickly. They abandoned properties. They stopped showing up to meetings. They aimed for anonymity. Most were found. Others tried to create distance by intentionally lowering their visibility. They stopped earning aggressively. They minimized conversations. They avoided decision-making roles. That strategy failed as well, because low visibility itself had become suspicious. The family had reached the point where being noticeable and being invisible were equally dangerous. And in the background of all of this stood Casso, continuing to authorize removals at a pace that left no room for explanation. At this stage, he no longer needed consensus. He no longer waited for broad agreement. His judgment had become the mechanism that if Casso believed you were a problem, you became one, that if he decided you were a risk, your life entered a countdown. This created a psychological feedback loop. The more men feared him, the more men attempted to protect themselves through quiet maneuvering. And the more maneuvering he observed, the more he believed betrayal was inevitable in his mind. He had not created the instability, he was responding to it. This is where the machine began consuming itself. Inside law enforcement, long-term investigation units had started noticing large clusters of disappearances tied to the same constellation of businesses, meeting locations, and shifting allegiances. But they lacked the final connective tissue to bind the cases into a prosecutable structure. That connective tissue still lived inside the organization, and someone was beginning to collect it. This man was not a captain, that he was not a celebrity. He did not carry public power. He was a facilitator, a man who moved messages, who arranged cars, who delivered instructions, who saw the same faces reappear at the edges of multiple removals. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. Then it happened again, and again that he noticed that certain names vanished after being spoken near certain places. He noticed that particular drivers always resurfaced after trouble resolved itself. He noticed that instructions often passed through the same limited channels. Most importantly, he realized that no one survived after being labeled a risk by Anthony Casso. Not captains, not veterans, not friends. This man did not hate Casso. In fact, for years he had admired him. He believed in the structure. Until he realized that the structure no longer contained an exit. At night, he began rehearsing what he would say if suddenly confronted. He practiced answers that might buy him seconds. Seconds that might turn into minutes. Minutes that might turn into escape. Eventually, fear became unbearable. Not the fear of rivals, not the fear of prison, but the fear of random erasure. That is the most powerful fear of all. And one night, without warning anyone, he vanished. Goodbye, signals, safe destination shared. At first, the disappearance caused confusion. Some assumed he had been taken out. Others assumed he had fled due to anxiety. But as days passed, something far more dangerous erupted beneath the surface. Information began to leak that should have remained sealed. Law enforcement started appearing at places only insiders knew about. Surveillance arrived too close to critical operations. A safe location was compromised that had existed for years without exposure. Inside the family, a terrible realization spread quietly. Someone had not been killed, someone had escaped. And worse, someone had taken knowledge with him. For the first time in over a decade, Anthony Casso faced a threat not rooted in street defiance or internal rivalry. He faced the threat of narrative exposure. Because violence, no matter how extreme, only dominates as long as it remains misunderstood. Once the story begins, forming coherently outside the system, power enters a new phase, a weaker one. The confirmation came quietly, not through an arrest notice, not through an indictment, but through absence. The man who vanished was not found dead. No body surfaced. No rumor of execution circulated. Instead, law enforcement activity began appearing with a level of precision that could only come from someone who knew the inside of the machine. Safe locations were compromised without warning. Meetings were missed seconds before surveillance arrived. Money routes were interrupted at pressure points too. Specific to be coincidence, inside the Lucchese family, the truth settled in slowly, and then all at once. Someone had flipped, not a low-level associate, not a frightened runner, someone who had seen structure. And that meant the danger was no longer local. It was systemic. Anthony Casso understood this faster than anyone else. For years, he had ruled through disappearance. Now someone had disappeared in a way he could not control. A man who had removed himself from fear rather than being removed by it. That represented a fundamental rupture in the logic that had kept everyone obedient. Because if one man could escape the system alive, then escape became imaginable. And imagination is the beginning of collapse. Casso responded with authority, not reflection. He ordered an internal purge, not one hit. Many. Anyone who had direct contact with the missing man moved into immediate suspicion. Drivers who had shared routes with him. Messengers who had carried his words. People who had sat beside him during meetings that now felt like rehearsals for betrayal. Men vanished within days. Some were killed. Some were never found. Each removal was meant to communicate certainty, but the message no longer landed cleanly. Because the core truth could not be erased. Someone was talking. Fear began to behave differently inside the family. It no longer pointed only downward from power. It now moved sideways. Partners began suspecting partners. Crews stopped warning each other. Information was withheld not to protect the organization, but to protect the self. The logic of survival had shifted. Casso could feel it. Meetings felt shorter. Eyes darted more often. Men nodded without conviction. Respect still existed, but trust had begun to die. And trust, once damaged inside a criminal hierarchy, never heals quietly. It fractures outward. Each man becomes responsible only for his own continuation to this stage. Anthony Casso did something he had never needed to do before. He began to hide. Safe houses rotated more frequently. Movement became irregular. Routes changed without explanation. For the first time in his career, he was not positioning himself as the immovable center. He was retreating inside his own creation. That single shift told everyone paying attention something that no one would say out loud. The man who had built the system of fear no longer fully trusted it. And that realization spread faster than any rumor. Because fear is powerful, but fear without certainty turns into flight. The man who defected had not just betrayed Casso, he had demonstrated the unthinkable, that survival might exist beyond obedience. And once that idea entered the bloodstream of the organization, Anthony Casso's era of absolute internal control was already ending. The only question left was how violently the collapse would unfold. Chapter 3. The trap begins to close. By the early 1990s, the collapse inside the Lucchese crime family had reached a level that could no longer remain invisible. Too many men were missing. Too many operations were breaking down. Too many internal secrets were leaking into the outside world. For the first time in over a decade, the violence tied to Anthony Casso was no longer contained inside the criminal ecosystem that IT was spilling outward. Inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, long-term organized crime units had been gathering fragments for years, isolated murders, financial anomalies, witness statements that never fully aligned. But now, those fragments were beginning to assemble into something far more dangerous than a pattern. The missing insider from Chapter 2 did not walk into law enforcement with a full confession on day one. He moved carefully. He tested the edges. He released information in controlled amounts, names, meeting locations, financial pathways, and most importantly, structured. He explained how murders were ordered, who approved them, how crews were selected, how bodies disappeared without witnesses, how fear itself was being used as the operating system of the family. For agents who had spent their careers chasing fragments, this was the missing skeleton key. And at the center of it all, one name surfaced again and again: Anthony Casso. Not as a gunman, not as a soldier, but as the coordinator, the architect, the man whose approval turned rumor into death. Surveillance intensified quietly. Phones were tapped without immediate arrests. Wiretaps recorded voices that believed they still lived in secrecy. For the first time, the outside world began hearing the internal language of fear in real time. Inside New York City, Casso felt the pressure before it ever became visible. Certain safe houses no longer felt insulated. Certain routes felt watched. Certain messengers stopped returning. But the most dangerous shift was psychological. He could no longer tell who remained loyal, because loyalty had become indistinguishable from performance. Men said what they were supposed to say. They showed up where they were supposed to show up. But something underneath had changed. The certainty was gone. Casso responded by shrinking his circle again and again. Only a handful of men retained direct access to him. And even those men were watched continuously. Trust had been replaced with containment. The federal strategy, however, was not to arrest him immediately. It was to surround him. Allow fear to continue eroding the structure from within while evidence accumulated from every direction. Indictments were being drafted that no one outside closed rooms even suspected existed. Wiretap transcripts grew thick. Financial records stacked into towers. Witness lists expanded quietly. Casso was no longer being investigated as a participant. He was being studied as the core. And still, he continued ordering violence. Not because violence was still effective, but because it was the only language he had ever trusted. This created the final contradiction of his career. Every killing meant to protect him was now generating new evidence. Every disappearance meant to preserve silence was now producing new witnesses. Every act meant to reinforce fear was now accelerating exposure. But Casso could not stop, because stopping would mean acknowledging that fear no longer worked. And for the first time in his life, fear was no longer working. The indictments did not arrive with sirens. They arrived with timing. While Anthony Casso still believed fear was holding his world together, federal prosecutors were quietly finalizing one of the largest organized crime cases New York had seen in years. Pages of wiretap transcripts, financial trails extending through shell companies and cash businesses. Testimony from men who had once believed silence was their only protection. By the time the paperwork was complete, Casso's fate was already sealed. He just did not know it yet. Across New York City, surveillance tightened so slowly it felt like nothing at all. Cars appeared in familiar places and then vanished. Faces repeated in crowds, but never long enough to be certain. Phones clicked faintly in ways no one could openly acknowledge. Inside the Lucchese family, word began to travel that something massive was forming. Not a single arrest, not a single hit, but a wave. Casso dismissed the early warnings. For decades, he had survived pressure by crushing it. Every investigation he had ever faced collapsed under silence, intimidation, or death. In his mind, this would be no different. What he did not understand was that this investigation was no longer built on fear. It was built on documentation. On tape, captured in his own words and in the words of his peers. On charts showing when money moved and who disappeared afterward. On testimony that stitched individual murders into a single sustained conspiracy. By the time he sensed the scale of what was approaching, the structure that had always protected him had already been bypassed. The raids began before dawn. Not just one location. Many doors came down across multiple boroughs. Soldiers, captains, drivers, messengers. Some were dragged from their beds. Others were intercepted on their way to work. Phones were seized mid-call. Ledgers vanished into evidence bags. For hours, confusion flooded the streets. Who had been hit? Who had not? Who had talked? Anthony Casso went into full isolation. Movement became frantic. Safe houses rotated in panic rather than planning. Communication fragmented into whispers passed through too many hands. Each delay felt catastrophic. He was no longer commanding operations. He was evading them. Why now? His name had appeared openly in sealed indictments. Prosecutors were no longer treating him as a background figure. They named him as a central organizer of murder and racketeering at the highest level. And yet, even as the walls closed in, Casso still believed he could maneuver his way out, because fear had always been his final defense. What he did not understand was that the people now surrounding him were not afraid of him. They were protected from him. And that distinction changed everything. Anthony Casso was arrested without spectacled, no televised chase, no dramatic stand-off, no last-minute escape. Just a quiet, controlled operation that unfolded with mechanical certainty. For a man who had spent his life mastering the art of making others feel hunted, the reversal was absolute. He was the one being tracked now, the one being surrounded, the one with no remaining exits. The officers who took him into custody did not raise their voices. They did not rush. They did not need to. By the time they arrived, the maze had already closed. The moment the handcuffs snapped shut, a psychological shift rippled through the underworld. Not disbelief. Recognition. Anthony Casso was no longer untouchable. Inside holding cells and back rooms across the city, men who had lived in terror for years allowed themselves a single, dangerous thought. The man who kept killing might finally be contained. But the arrest did not bring relief the way many expected. It brought uncertainty, because fear does not disappear just because its source is removed. It lingers. Casso was immediately isolated. Restrictions were tight. Communication was heavily monitored. The same silence he had once weaponized against others was now being applied to him. And for the first time in his life, Anthony Casso was forced to wait without control. Days passed, then weeks. Charges began to surface in fragments. Murder, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction. The words piled up without clear resolution. He listened, he memorized, he calculated. Inside his own mind, the machinery never stopped. Casso did not panic. He did not break down. He began adapting. Because fear had never been his only weapon. Information was. From the moment of his arrest, he began analyzing his surroundings not as a defeated man, but as a strategist trapped in a different battlefield. Guards, inmates, movement schedules, communication delays. Every new environment became something to map, but this time, he was mapping his own confinement. Outside, the impact of his arrest echoed unevenly. Some men vanished immediately. Others reached out quietly to prosecutors. A few attempted to destroy records in panicked bursts. The collapse was not loud. It was messy and full of mistakes. The organization he had helped stabilize through murder was now unraveling through exposure. And still, Anthony Casso had not truly lost his final advantage, his knowledge, because the story was not over, not even close. His arrest did not end the fear surrounding his name. It transferred it into a new form. Point one that would soon terrify everyone who had ever depended on his silence. Chapter 4. The interrogation rooms. Inside the detention facility, time slowed into something unfamiliar for Anthony Casso. For most of his life, he had controlled the pace of fear. Now, fear controlled the pace of his days. The interrogation rooms were not loud. They were quiet, cold, deliberate. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not rush him. They did not threaten him. They did not promise him anything in the beginning. They simply let him sit. Hours passed without questions. Then questions arrived without pressure. They asked about meetings, then paused. They asked about money, then paused. They asked about men who were already dead, and then they paused again. This strategy was not designed to break him emotionally. It was designed to let reality begin pressing inward without resistance. Casso listened carefully. He answered almost nothing. At first, that he still believed. This was another standoff he could win through silence. That the same fear he had used outside prison would somehow protect him inside it. That men would remain quiet. That loyalty would hold. But loyalty was already collapsing beyond the walls. While he sat in holding, indictments expanded. More arrests followed. More names were pulled into open court. And every day, new pieces of the structure he had once controlled began appearing in public language. Witness lists grew. Tape transcripts surfaced. Old disappearances were suddenly spoken about openly for the first time in years. The silence he had built was being dismantled sentence by sentence. And for the first time since his rise to power, Anthony Casso was forced to confront a truth he had always avoided. Fear works only when the threat is present. Behind bars, the threat disappears. The agents did not need to threaten him anymore. The world was doing that for them. They showed him photographs. They showed him names crossed out in legal documents. They showed him timelines he did not know the government possessed. Still, he said almost nothing. Then something subtle changed. That he began asking questions. Not about legal strategy, about who had already talked. This was the first crack. Because a man who still believed in absolute loyalty would not need to ask, Casso learned that multiple men from within his own circle had already cooperated. Men he once trusted with scheduling, transport, surveillance, and money. Some had flipped early, some had flipped late. But together, they had reconstructed a version of his world that the government could now see clearly. And that terrified him far more than prison ever could, because prison still meant survival. Exposure meant erasure of his myth. Over time, isolation began to work on him not as torture, but as reflection. He replayed years of decisions. The purge, the paranoia, the acceleration. The man who had vanished and taken the narrative with him. That he realized something too late. He had ruled through silence for so long that he no longer had relationships strong enough to withstand pressure. Fear creates obedience. It does not create protection. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began to discuss a possibility they never expected. That Anthony Casso, the most feared man in New York, might one day choose a path more destructive than violence. He might choose to talk. And if he did, the damage would reach far beyond anything he had ever accomplished as an enforcer. The first negotiations did not begin with promises. They began with information. Prosecutors already knew enough to keep Anthony Casso in prison for the rest of his life. He understood that almost immediately. The evidence was no longer theoretical. It was layered, cross-verified, documented through recordings and first-hand testimony. This was not a case built on rumor. It was built on infrastructure. And that changed the balance of power completely. The agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation no longer asked him what he had done. They asked him what he still wanted to protect. That question carried more weight than any threat ever could. At first, Casso dismissed the idea of cooperation entirely. The rule he had enforced for decades was absolute. Silence was survival. Anyone who talked was erased. The thought of becoming what he had hunted sickened him, but the reality of his situation was unforgiving. He was facing multiple life sentences. He was isolated from his former network. He was surrounded by men who no longer feared him. And most importantly, he was being informed, piece by piece, of everything that was already known. That he learned that former allies had testified about murders he believed were completely buried. He learned that financial trails he thought were clean had been reconstructed. He learned that some of the very men he had trusted to remove problems were now speaking freely about how the problems had been removed. Each new disclosure stripped away another layer of his illusion of control. Then the prosecutors offered him something far more dangerous than leniency. They offered him relevance. They explained that he still possessed something no one else could fully replicate: the deepest structure of the violence, the logic behind the decisions, the internal conversations that had never been recorded. They told him that the case did not only need witnesses who had pulled triggers. It needed someone who could explain why the triggers were pulled in the first place. They needed the author, not just the page. Casso did not answer immediately. He requested time. Days passed. Then weeks. In isolation, his world shrank to memory and calculation. He replayed who had betrayed him, who had survived, who had vanished without ever being avenged. He began to understand that the family he had enforced through fear no longer existed in any recognizable form. The structure was already broken. His silence would not rebuild it. And that realization carved out a new space inside his thinking. For the first time in his life, Anthony Casso began to envision fear not as something he projected outward, but as something he could reverse if he talked. The fear would no longer belong to him. That it would belong to everyone else. That possibility did not frighten him. It intrigued him. The men who had once controlled him through loyalty and hierarchy had abandoned him to survive. Now he had the chance to return the favor, quietly, legally, irrevocably. When he finally signaled that he was willing to discuss terms, constitutional alarms rang deep inside the underworld. Not because it was confirmed, but because it was now possible. And the possibility of Anthony Casso speaking was more terrifying than any gun he had ever aimed. Because violence can be contained, information cannot. Anthony Casso did not announce his decision to cooperate. There was no dramatic declaration, no emotional confession, no visible surrender. It happened the same way he had always operated. Quietly, he signaled to prosecutors that he was ready to talk about one name. Just one. They understood immediately what that meant. Once the first name was spoken, the entire structure would begin to unravel. The earliest information he offered did not target low-level soldiers. He went upward. He named men who still believed themselves protected. Men who thought rank would shield them. Men who still believed Casso would die before he ever spoke. He described meetings that had never been observed, conversations that had never been recorded, disputes that had ended in erasure long before law enforcement could react. For the first time, prosecutors were not just hearing about crimes. They were hearing about decision-making, why certain men were selected, why others were spared, how suspicion became a death sentence, how fear replaced investigation inside the organization. What shocked them most was not the violence. It was how calmly Casso explained it. There was no justification in his voice, no regret, no anger. Only sequence. This led to arrest warrants that landed like quiet earthquakes across New York. Men who had survived decades of organized crime suddenly found themselves exposed by the very man they had once feared. Inside the underworld, the reaction was not disbelief. It was horror, because Casso had not just broken the code, he had inverted it. The man who had spent his life punishing betrayal was now using betrayal as his final weapon. Veteran mobsters who had once spoken his name in lowered voices now refused to speak it at all. Some went to ground immediately. Others attempted to flee. A few reached out desperately to law enforcement in the hope of avoiding what they believed was now inevitable. But nothing moved faster than the damage already in motion. Prosecutors used Casso's testimony to reinforce cases that had once felt incomplete. Timelines solidified. Loose ends connected. Disappearances that had existed only as rumors suddenly acquired structure and causation. Families who had waited years without answers finally learned how their loved ones had been selected for removal, not out of vengeance, out of calculation. And with every revelation, Anthony Casso's reputation evolved again. He was no longer only feared as a killer, he was now feared as a witness. The shift was irreversible. Men who had ordered murders suddenly found themselves named as authors of those orders. Men who had never been formally tied to violence now found their private authority translated into public indictment. The empire that had once moved in shadow was being dragged, piece by piece, into the light. And behind all of it sat Anthony Casso. In protection, in isolation, in control of the most dangerous currency left to him, truth. But in choosing that path, he had also signed away the last illusion of loyalty that had ever surrounded his name. He did not leave the underworld as a fallen king. He left it as something far more despised, a man who had turned the fear outward at the very end. Chapter 5. The Informant Who Became the Target. Anthony Casso entered the witness protection system not as a man seeking redemption, but as a man seeking leverage in a new environment. For the first time, he was no longer surrounded by men who feared his reputation. He was surrounded by federal handlers, prosecutors, and sealed courtrooms. The language of power had changed to no threats, to no intimidation, to no visible hierarchy. Only law, procedure, and testimony. Casso adjusted quickly. He learned how to speak carefully, how to pause at the right moments, how to emphasize details that mattered, and how to withhold others for later. To prosecutors, he became something rare, not just a cooperator, but a strategic witness that he could explain how murder had functioned as policy, how suspicion had replaced evidence, how fear had been intentionally cultivated as a management style. He named people still active, people still dangerous, people who believed he would never testify, and one by one, those people began appearing in courtrooms. Indictments expanded in every direction. Old cases were reopened. Unsolved executions suddenly found structure. Stories that had once been rumored gained names, dates, and order. For law enforcement, this was unprecedented. For the underworld, it was catastrophic. Because Anthony Casso was not just confirming what investigators suspected, he was explaining why it had worked for so long. That kind of testimony does not merely convict individuals. It disassembles systems. Inside organized crime circles, a shift took hold. Casso was no longer spoken of as a fallen enforcer. He was spoken of as a liability without expiration. Every new court date carried the possibility of another betrayal, another name, another timeline cracking open. And for the first time in his life, Anthony Casso became something he had never been before. He became hunted, not by street crews by memory, by men in courtrooms who now saw his face on transcripts, by families of victims who learned his role in decisions that had erased their futures, and by former allies who now understood that his mouth was more dangerous than any gun he had ever aimed. In witness protection, fear has a different shape. There is no overt menace, no visible enemy. Just the constant knowledge that somewhere, someone is waiting for a mistake. Casso moved locations repeatedly. Identities changed. Environments shifted. But one thing never left him: the certainty that the world he had destroyed now understood his value. Not as a killer, as a source of irreversible truth. For a man who had built his entire life on secrecy, this reversal was absolute. And it was only the beginning. Because cooperation did not bring him safety the way it brings most informants. It brought him something far more unpredictable: exposure. At first, other cooperators did not know what to make of Anthony Casso. Some had come forward out of fear, some out of regret, some because they believed prison was unavoidable. But Casso came forward with calculation. He did not look like a man seeking forgiveness. He looked like a man choosing a different battlefield. Inside protected facilities, word spread quietly that the most feared enforcer in New York was now on the government's side. Some informants felt a twisted sense of relief. Others felt unease because they knew his history. They had lived under the rules he enforced, and they understood something the prosecutors were only beginning to grasp. Anthony Casso had never followed anyone's agenda but his own. Even now, first, his cooperation produced results that stunned investigators. His memory was precise. Dates aligned. Locations matched physical evidence. His understanding of internal power structures gave prosecutors leverage they had never possessed before. But as the months passed, subtle contradictions began to appear, small inconsistencies, timelines that shifted slightly, details that changed depending on who was asking .it first. These discrepancies were dismissed as the natural fog of long criminal years. But over time, a new concern emerged. Casso was not simply telling the truth, he was shaping it. He emphasized certain figures, minimized his own proximity to some decisions, elevated the guilt of some men while softening others. Most witnesses. Cooperation is surrendered. Anthony Casso. Cooperation was still influence. Prosecutors began to realize they were not dealing with a reformed criminal. They were dealing with a strategist who had simply learned to operate within a new system of power. Behind closed doors, concerns formed quietly. Was he fully reliable? Was he redirecting blame? Was he using the government the way he had once used? Fear, and deeper still, another fear developed. Casso enjoyed the role. He enjoyed watching old enemies lose power. He enjoyed seeing men who had once outranked him hesitate in chains. He enjoyed knowing that with every sentence he spoke, someone else's fate shifted. For a man whose entire life had revolved around control, this new position gave him something dangerously familiar: relevance. But with relevance came exposure. In courtrooms, transcripts of his testimony circulated among journalists. His name appeared in public filings attached to murders that had once been nameless rumors. Families who had waited years for answers now knew precisely who had approved the final decisions. And as his image emerged into the daylight, something else grew with it. Hatred. Not theoretical hatred, personal hatred. Men sitting in courtrooms stared at him with years of buried fury in their eyes. Former associates whispered his name not as a symbol of fear, but as a betrayal without limit. Anthony Casso had crossed a line that can never be uncrossed in organized crime. He had traded silence for survival. And survival does not taste the same when it is surrounded by witnesses. Inside witness protection, his handlers tightened his security. Movements became more restricted. Interactions became supervised. He was no longer just a cooperator, he was a high-risk liability. Not because he might be attacked, but because his behavior itself was becoming unpredictable. And yet, none of this slowed him. If anything, it sharpened him, because Casso realized something important. As long as he remained useful, he remained protected, and usefulness, in his world, had always meant one thing: information. For a time, Anthony Casso believed he had mastered his new role. He spoke. Cases moved forward. Men were convicted. And as long as the machinery kept turning, he believed his protection was permanent. But the very thing that had made him powerful on the streets was now becoming a danger in the courtroom. Control. Prosecutors began to notice that Casso's testimony followed patterns of self-preservation. He placed himself at the center of knowledge, but always at the edge of responsibility. He described murders with clarity, yet his own role often appeared softened by distance. First, this was tolerated. Then it became problematic. Defense attorneys began to cross-examine him with precision. They highlighted inconsistencies across separate testimonies. They contrasted his statements with those of other cooperating witnesses. They pointed out moments where his story seemed to shift just enough to benefit himself. Slowly, the image the jury was seeing began to change, not from killer to victim, but from killer to manipulator. Behind closed doors, prosecutors from the U.S. Department of Justice began debating an uncomfortable truth. Casso might be telling many truths, but he was not telling the whole truth. And worse, he was still trying to influence outcomes. In one particularly damaging moment, investigators discovered that he had misrepresented his level of involvement in a key murder that formed the backbone of a major case. The discrepancy was not small. It was structural. It forced prosecutors to re-examine portions of testimony they had already relied upon in court. For the first time since his cooperation began, his value to the government was no longer unquestioned. And for Casso, that realization was catastrophic, because usefulness had always been his shield. Inside his protected environment, restrictions tightened further. Conversations were limited. Privileges were reduced. He was no longer treated as a strategic partner, he was being treated as a risk. Then came the moment he could not manipulate. Prosecutors formally accused him of violating the terms of his cooperation by lying under oath and attempting to shield portions of his own culpability. This was not framed as a misunderstanding. It was framed as deception. In that instant, everything reversed. The protection he had carefully navigated began to collapse. The leverage he believed he possessed evaporated. The same system that had once elevated his voice now questioned his very credibility. Anthony Casso was about to lose the last safe position he had left in the world, not because he had spoken, but because he had tried to control how he was judged. For the first time in his life, the machinery of law did not respond to fear, strategy, or reputation. It responded to verification. And verification no longer favored him. The decision came quietly. His cooperation agreement was terminated. In one stroke. The man who had once controlled murder in New York lost his final shield, and no longer a protected witness, and no longer a bargaining asset, just a defendant again. And this time, there would be no system left for him to hide inside. Chapter 6. When the courtroom became the battlefield. When Anthony Casso lost his cooperation agreement, the change was immediate and irreversible. He was no longer an asset. He was no longer protected. He was no longer useful. He became what he had always tried to delay, becoming a defendant with no leverage left. The transfer back into the general federal prison system stripped away every illusion of control he had built during cooperation. Guards no longer treated him as a witness. Prosecutors no longer consulted him as a resource. He moved through corridors as just another inmate facing multiple life sentences. But this time, fear no longer worked in his favor. Outside, the cases against him began to move forward at full force. Prosecutors from the U.S. Department of Justice built their strategy not on his words, but on years of independent evidence that had been strengthened by other witnesses. Wiretaps, financial trails, surveillance, forensic reconstructions, testimony from men who had nothing left to lose. The courtrooms where Casso now appeared were nothing like the interrogation rooms he once occupied. There was no negotiation here. Only judgment. From the first day of trial, the weight of what he faced became visible. Dozens of counts. Murders tied to his direction. Conspiracies that spanned years. A structure of violence finally translated into legal language. Casso sat quietly as names were read aloud. Men he had ordered killed. Men he had supervised. Men he had once trusted and later discarded. Each name brought with it a story. A last known moment. A family left waiting. A disappearance that now had a public explanation. For the first time, the violence he had always kept procedural became narrative, and narrative has power of its own. Unlike life on the street, the courtroom did not respond to intimidation. There were no whispered threats, no shifting alliances, no room to maneuver through fear. Every word entered into record stayed there, permanent. Defense attorneys made their case. They attacked witness credibility. They challenged timelines. They attempted to fracture the story into isolated incidents rather than a single sustained conspiracy, but the structure held, because this time, it was not built on one man's testimony. It was built on accumulation. Casso watched as the world he had once controlled appeared piece by piece in public view. The routes, the safe houses, the decisions, the murders, nothing could be erased now. And for the first time in his life, Anthony Casso was completely unable to erase anything. He had delayed consequences for decades. But in this room, delay no longer existed. Only outcome. The witnesses who sealed Anthony Casso's fate did not resemble the men who once crowded his world. They arrived without swagger, without reputation, without fear in their posture. Some were former soldiers. Some were intermediaries. Some were men who had once obeyed every rule he enforced. They did not come to challenge him. They came to explain him point one by one. They described how instructions had moved, how surveillance preceded disappearances, how meetings ended with silent decisions that no one dared question. They spoke about the moment they realized murder had become routine rather than exceptional. Most devastating of all were the men who had worked directly beneath him. They explained his discipline, his calm, his preference for planning over emotion, his insistence that every action feel impersonal. They told the jury that Casso did not kill out of rage, that he killed out of management. Defense attorneys tried to portray these witnesses as traitors, as liars, as men trying to save themselves at the expense of another. But the stories overlapped too perfectly. Names, locations, dates, methods. The pieces aligned with evidence already entered into record. The portrait that formed was not of a reckless killer. It was of a man who had turned murder into a system. And then came the families. They did not speak about hierarchy. They did not explain criminal structure. They did not describe power. They spoke about absence, a father who never came home, a brother who never answered again, a husband who left for a meeting and vanished. For years, these families had lived inside unanswered questions. Now they were hearing the truth publicly, for the first time, in a room where it could no longer be denied. Anthony Casso did not look at them. For a man who had faced armed enemies without blinking, the weight of being seen by the consequences of his actions was a different kind of pressure. The trial stretched on. Weeks of testimony, thousands of pages of documentation. Every attempt to fracture the case failed, because the story was no longer about one decision. It was about a pattern, and patterns are harder to break than any single accusation. When closing statements finally arrived, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of argument. It felt like a place of reckoning. Prosecutors described Casso not as the most violent man in the room, but as the man who made violence ordinary, the one who standardized it, the one who transformed fear into policy. Defense replied with the only strategy left: doubt. But doubt has limits when a structure of truth has already solidified. The jury did not deliberate for long, and when they returned, Anthony Casso heard the word that had followed him his entire life. Guilty. On count after count. On murder. On conspiracy. On racketeering. On obstruction. The verdict was not dramatic. It was final. The machinery that had once moved at his command had now passed judgment on him, and there was nothing left to manipulate. His sentencing took place weeks after the verdict. By that time, Anthony Casso no longer looked like the man who had once terrified New York's underworld. The posture was smaller. The movements were slower. The eyes no longer scanned the room for weakness. They waited. The judge spoke about the scale of the violence, not as individual crimes, but as a sustained system of terror that had reshaped entire communities. He spoke about the lives erased not in moments of chaos, but through procedure, about how fear had been used not as a reaction, but as a governing tool. Casso listened without visible reaction. This was not new language to him. It was simply the first time it was being spoken about him in a room where he had no authority. When the sentence was read, it was not framed as one punishment. It was framed as permanence. Multiple life terms to no possibility of early release, no remaining leveraged, no future negotiation. The words did not fall with drama. They settled. And in that settling, everything Anthony Casso had ever controlled disappeared at once. He was no longer a commander, no longer a strategist, no longer a witness with value, no longer a man whose name could move fear through a room. He was now an inmate number, escorted out in silence, behind the walls that had once been used to contain others. Outside the courtroom, there was no celebration, no cheers, no public sense of victory. Only quiet relief among families who had waited for decades for answers that could never truly repair what had been lost. Inside the prison system, Casso entered a world governed by something he had never successfully dominated: routine, movement at fixed hours, lights on and off without negotiation, orders that could not be refused, walls that could not be bypassed. For the first time in his life, Anthony Casso lived inside a structure where violence no longer produced outcomes, where fear no longer generated compliance, where reputation carried no operational value. The man who had spent his life making others disappear now moved through a world where he could not make himself visible in any meaningful way. The transformation was complete. The most feared man in New York had become one of the most restricted men in the country, and for the first time, there was no system left for him to hide inside. Chapter 7. The Silence After Power. Prison did not explode into Anthony Casso's life. It closed around him. Steel doors, concrete corridors, controlled movement, predictable hours. For a man who had ruled through uncertainty, this was a world built on certainty. Every step was scheduled, every meal announced, every night enforced. There were no secrets here. The first realization came quickly. Fear no longer traveled ahead of him. In the beginning, a few inmates recognized his name. Whispers moved through cell blocks. Some watched him carefully, expecting the legend to announce itself. It never did. Casso did not arrive as a king among criminals. He arrived as an old man with no authority. In prison, violence is not managed by reputation alone. It is managed by alliances, adaptability, and constant negotiation with people who do not care about your past. And no one owed Anthony Casso anything anymore. The men around him were not debtors. They were not soldiers. They were not subordinates. They were simply inmates. This forced a transformation he had never before experienced. He had to coexist. Days passed in rigid sameness. Walk to meals. Walk to rec, walk back to the cell. The routine did not reward dominance. It rewarded endurance. At first, Casso tried to observe. He mapped social clusters. He noted who controlled which spaces. He studied who spoke for whom. The same instincts that had once allowed him to dominate city blocks now searched for patterns in small hallways. But every instinct met the same wall. There was no structure for him to inhabit, no organization to infiltrate, no engine of violence that responded to his approval. His history followed him only as a story, and stories do not produce power. Behind bars the way they do on the streets, some inmates tested him verbally, not with threats, with indifference. That was the true humiliation. They did not need to challenge him. Ignoring him was enough. For the first time in his life, Anthony Casso experienced what it meant to exist without leveraged, no money. He could move to no men he could send, no fear. He could project beyond arm's reach. His control had always depended on distance, on separation, on being the man behind the curtain. Now the curtain was gone, and he had nowhere to step back into. Nights became the hardest, without movement, without strategy, without the constant external problem-solving that had once filled his mind. Time slowed. Memory grew louder, and memory is the one arena where a man like Anthony Casso cannot issue orders. He could not erase yesterday, but he could only relive it. And prison gives a man endless space to do exactly that. As weeks turned into months, Anthony Casso learned the true difference between fear on the streets and reality behind prison walls. That on the outside, fear had moved for him. Inside, fear had nowhere to travel. Other inmates did not rush him. They did not confront him dramatically. Most did something far worse. They measured him. In prison, men watch quietly. They study who reacts, who flinches, who tries to dominate too quickly, who retreats too often. Respect is not given to history. It is granted only by behavior in the present moment. And Casso's present offered nothing to build on. He did not control money inside. He did not control protection. He did not control movement. What little recognition he received came not with reverence, but with curiosity. Some inmates asked questions about the past. A few wanted to hear stories, not because they admired him, but because they were bored. Because violence, to them, was entertainment rather than command. Casso answered very little. Silence had once been his greatest weapon. Now it was simply his condition. Without power to project outward, his internal world began to change in ways he could not regulate. The constant calculation that had once filled every waking hour had nowhere to land. No enemies to eliminate. No systems to optimize. No structure to manipulate. The mind, deprived of purpose, turns inward. And inward is where consequence lives. In the quiet hours of lockup, the sounds of prison carried through concrete. Distant arguments. Metal doors. Footsteps in measured patterns. A cough echoing down the block. These sounds did not frighten him. What frightened him was the absence of influence. For the first time in his life, nothing adjusted when he existed. The lights stayed on and off at their assigned hours regardless of his state of mind. Meals arrived whether he spoke or not. Guards addressed him by number, not by reputation. That he began to understand something he had never confronted before. Power had not only controlled others, that it had structured his identity. Without it, there was no role left to perform. Some inmates attempted to provoke him, testing whether the old legend still carried any spark. A comment here, a challenge there. Nothing direct at first. Casso did not react. Not because he was calm, because reaction no longer produced consequence. In his previous life, a single response could move chains of action across the city. Here, a response meant nothing beyond a moment of noise, and noise carried no leverage. That realization hollowed something fundamental. The man who had once ruled through anticipation now lived inside total predictability. Each day resembled the last. Each week dissolved into the same motions. Progress no longer existed. Only duration. It is one thing to lose power in a dramatic collapse. It is another to have it evaporate slowly, without spectacle, until one day you realize there is nothing left to lose. Casso's body weakened before his posture ever did. Age crept into joints that had once moved with lethal certainty. Illness lingered longer. Fatigue settled deeper. And still, The prison moved on without acknowledging any of it. The structure did not respond to decline.it absorbed it. For a man who had built his life on forcing systems to respond, this was the final inversion. The world would no longer move for him, not even slightly. The decline did not arrive all at once. It arrived in increments, a missed walk to the yard, a longer pause before standing, a cough that stayed too long, a fatigue that no amount of rest could erase. Anthony Casso had spent his life watching for sudden turns, ambushes, betrayals, rapid shifts of control. But the body does not announce its takeover. It advances quietly. In the medical unit, he became another chart, another record, another aging inmate with a history that no longer carried weight in the present. The guard spoke to him without fear. The staff treated him without reverence. He was not a legend here, he was a patient. Illness stripped away the last physical remnants of intimidation. The voice softened, the frame thinned. The energy that had once driven relentless coordination now struggled to sustain ordinary movement. And still, the prison routines continued untouched. Meals arrived. Head counts continued. Lights switched on and off. The system did not slow for him. Isolation deepened in ways it never had before. Fewer conversations. Fewer glances from passing inmates. Whatever curiosity had followed his arrival had long since faded. In prison, relevance is temporary. Obscurity is permanent. Night. When the lights dimmed and the cell settled into stillness, there was no longer strategy to occupy his thoughts. No calculations about threat and response. No planning of outcomes. Only memory. And memory, when it can no longer be acted upon, becomes something else entirely. Regret does not always announce itself as sorrow. Sometimes it arrives as repetition. Moments replayed without variation. Decisions resurfaced without context. Faces returned without names. The mind searched for leverage where none could exist. And for the first time, Anthony Casso could not escape the weight of what no longer served a function. Violence, stripped of consequence, loses its meaning. Fear, stripped of reach, loses its shape. Power, stripped of inheritance, becomes absence. In his final years, he was moved deeper into long-term care within the prison system. Fewer movements, fewer interactions, more time alone with the sound of scheduled life passing outside the door. The man who had once decided, who vanished, and who survived now waited for the same things every other inmate waited for. The next meal, the next head count, the next medical visit, the next light change. That he had ruled his world through elimination. Now he lived inside repetition, and repetition does not remember who you used to be. Chapter 8. When fear finally fell silent. Anthony Casso died the same way he had lived his final years, quietly. There was no announcement that moved through the prison in waves. No sudden change in routine. No visible reaction from the outside world. His passing did not interrupt schedules or alter the rhythm of the institution that had absorbed him. One day, he was simply no longer present. The man who had once decided the fate of others without hesitation now left without ceremony. Inside the prison, his death was recorded as procedure. Time of death, cause, documentation. The administrative language of endings is always simple. It leaves no space for reputation. For the guards and medical staff, he was another aging inmate whose body had finally failed. For most of the prison population, he was already a ghost long before his heart stopped. But outside the walls, his death traveled differently. Not loudly, in whispers. Among former associates who had survived the years of purges. Among families of men who had vanished decades earlier. Among investigators who had spent their careers mapping a system that had once seemed impossible to fully dismantle. For some, his death felt anticlimactic. No trial at the end. No final confrontation. No confession that rewrote history. Just a slow fading inside concrete and steel. For others, it felt final in the truest sense. Because Anthony Casso had not only taken lives, he had built a culture where disappearance became normal. And now he had disappeared into the same quiet conclusion. There were no public funerals, no headlines that lingered, no figures of power stepping forward to claim his legacy. His name resurfaced briefly in old files and archived news. Then it returned to the place it had always lived best, the past. In the underworld, reactions were restrained. The men who remained understood that time had already done most of the work. The violence he had unleashed had consumed itself long before his body failed. In '01 feared retaliation, in '01 expected revenge. The system that had once moved at his direction had already learned how to exist without him. Because fear does not age gracefully, it either dominates completely or it dissolves. And by the time Anthony Casso died, fear had already been dissolving for years. What remained was not terror, but memory, and memory is a much quieter thing. For law enforcement, Anthony Casso's death did not feel like an ending. It felt like the final punctuation on a sentence that had already been written years earlier. Inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Department of Justice, his passing was noted, logged, and quietly circulated among investigators who had spent decades chasing the structure he once enforced. There were no celebrations, only reflection. For many agents, Casso had represented a rare case where violence had not merely erupted, but had been engineered. His career had forced a painful evolution in how organized crime was understood. Murder was no longer just an act of rage or greed. It could be a business model. His death did not erase the lessons learned from how he operated. If anything, it reinforced them. Investigators spoke privately about how his methods reshaped entire investigative strategies, how they learned to follow structure instead of personality, how they learned to map decision-making instead of only tracking shooters that TO them. Casso was not just a criminal, he was a blueprint of what unchecked internal power could become. For the families of victims, his death arrived with far more complicated weight. Some had waited decades just to hear a courtroom speak their loved one's name out loud. Some had received answers only after his cooperation began. Others never received confirmation at all. There was no shared reaction. Some felt relief. Some felt nothing at all. Some felt reopened grief that had never truly closed. Because when a man who ordered so much death dies quietly in a bed, the imbalance can feel unbearable. There is no symmetry between what was taken and what was returned. A prison death does not feel like justice to a mother who buried an empty coffin. Many families expressed the same unresolved truth, that knowing how their loved one died did not lessen the pain of losing them. It only replaced mystery with permanence. That Casso's body ended. But the echo of his decisions did not. Across court records, transcripts, and archived investigations, his name remained attached to a pattern of violence that had shaped an entire era of organized crime in New York. For survivors, his death did not bring closure. It brought a different question. What does justice look like when fear has already done the worst damage it could do? And the only honest answer anyone ever found was this: justice does not always arrive as balance. Sometimes it arrives simply as cessation. The violence stopped not because death was punished, but because the engine that had driven it finally ran out of time. After Anthony Casso's death, the underworld did not erupt into chaos. It adjusted quietly. The vacuum he left behind was not filled by a single figure. No man emerged with his reputation for calculated violence. No successor inherited his particular brand of terror. Instead, what followed was something far less dramatic: fragmentation. Crews that had once operated beneath a single axis of fear began separating into smaller, quieter units. Decisions that had once flowed through centralized authority now moved through scattered negotiations. Violence did not disappear, but it changed shape. It became restrained again, transactional, less ideological. Men were punished for betrayal once more, not for rumor. Suspicion no longer guaranteed execution. The culture of preemptive murder that Casso had perfected slowly lost its dominance, not because it was rejected, but because it was exhausting. Fear, when used as the primary engine of control, burns everyone eventually. The men who survived Casso's reign learned that lesson not through theory, but through attrition. Too many allies had vanished. Too much trust had disintegrated. What replaced him was not mercy. It was caution. The underworld became quieter again. Less blood in the streets, fewer internal purges, more negotiation, less annihilation. Not because people had become better, but because they had seen how completely a system built only on fear eventually devours itself. In '01 erected monuments to Anthony Casso. In '01 claimed his methods as a legacy worth preserving. In '01 younger generation sought to imitate him openly. His name became something else, a warning. Among veteran criminals, his story was retold not with admiration, but with a sense of grim inevitability. The same pattern repeated in every telling that a man who built power too efficiently, that a man who removed opposition too thoroughly, that a man who trusted fear more than loyalty, that a man who eventually stood alone inside the structure he had hollowed out. That is the fate of rulers who govern only through elimination. Once everyone else is gone, there is no one left to hold the world together. In the end, Anthony Casso did not fall in a blaze of confrontation. He did not die recklessly. He did not command a final act of violence. He simply disappeared into the quiet machinery of time. And the system he had once controlled learned how to continue without him. Less absolute, less terrifying, but far more stable. Chapter 9. Inside the mind of a man who chose fear. Profit never truly explained Anthony Casso. Money moved through his life in enormous volume, but it never defined his decisions. Men who worked only for profit calculate risk. They pull back when attention grows too sharp. They slow down when visibility becomes dangerous. Casso never slowed down. Even when the money was already secured. Even when the territory was already stable. Even when violence no longer served a financial purpose. For him, fear became the primary objective. This is where his psychology separated from most men in organized crime. Many criminals use violence to protect business. Anthony Casso used business to justify violence. From a psychological standpoint, he displayed a rare combination of traits that proved uniquely destructive when placed inside a criminal hierarchy. That he lacked emotional hesitation. He valued control over connection. He experienced satisfaction not from approval, but from certainty. Certainty that a decision would not be challenged. Certainty that opposition would not survive. Certainty that silence would follow. Fear produced all three. This made him different from impulsive killers driven by rage. Casso did not explode. He pressed. Slowly. Methodically. He did not chase confrontation. He designed inevitability in his mind. Violence was not an act. It was a solution endpoint. Problems entered one side. Bodies exited the other. Emotional friction required. What disturbed psychologists most when studying his behavior was not cruelty. It was consistency. He did not show visible inner conflict. He did not oscillate between aggression and guilt. He did not seek justification in ideology or honor. He did not speak in the language of loyalty or betrayal the way others did. He operated in the language of correction. When someone was removed, it was not framed as punishment. It was framed as adjustment. This is how a mind detaches from the moral weight of what it destroys. By redefining destruction as maintenance. Another defining feature of Casso's psychology was his relationship with doubt. Most men in violent worlds fear two things above all else: betrayal, exposure. Casso feared ambiguity. He despised situations that remained unresolved. Gray areas unsettled him. Lingering uncertainty felt like weakness. Murder solved uncertainty permanently. That a man who might become a problem tomorrow was no longer a variable if he was removed today. This obsession with eliminating uncertainty pushed him past strategic necessity into compulsion. By the height of his power, Casso was no longer reacting to real threats. He was reacting to possibilities, and possibility, once treated as justification for execution, has no natural stopping point. This is where his psychology crossed into obsession. Not obsession with money, not obsession with respect, not even obsession with dominance. Obsession with finality, the need to ensure that nothing remained unresolved. But the human world cannot be fully resolved through elimination. There are always new variables, new people, new tensions, new uncertainties. And this is why Casso's system had to grow more violent over time to maintain the same sense of control. Fear had to be continuously refreshed, and eventually, no amount of refreshment was enough. Because when the mind learns to depend on fear for order, it becomes unable to accept any form of stability that is not built on destruction. Anthony Casso's psychology did not form in isolation. It formed slowly, in an environment where emotional restraint was not taught as a virtue, but as a survival skill. From an early age, he learned that expression invited vulnerability, that anger could be punished, that weakness could be exploited. In such spaces, children do not learn how to process fear. They learn how to hide it. Over time, hiding becomes indistinguishable from not feeling at all. This emotional flattening did not turn him violent by itself. What it produced instead was detachment, a distance between action and feeling that allowed him to operate without internal resistance. Most people experience hesitation when contemplating harm. Casso learned how to bypass hesitation entirely. This did not happen through a single traumatic event. It developed through repetition, exposure to threats, exposure to intimidation, exposure to coercion, until eventually, these experiences no longer registered as dangers. They registered as normal. As he entered criminal spaces, this detachment became an asset. He was not rattled by confrontation. He did not react impulsively. He did not seek emotional validation after acts of violence. He simply moved forward. This is where a crucial psychological absence becomes visible. Anthony Casso did not crave admiration, that he craved control without friction. Most leaders, even violent ones, rely on a mixture of fear and loyalty. Fear compels obedience. Loyalty sustains it when fear is not present. Casso skipped loyalty entirely. Loyalty introduces uncertainty because people change. Fear is consistent. Fear does not negotiate. Fear does not drift. Fear does not require belief. It only requires memory. This made it more reliable in his mind than any alliance. But reliance on fear carries a hidden cost. It prevents emotional attachment. And emotional attachment is what stabilizes behavior over time. Without it, every relationship becomes instrumental. Every person becomes temporary. Every connection becomes expendable. This is why Casso's inner circle kept shrinking. Not because he was being betrayed constantly, but because he could not tolerate the vulnerability that trust requires. Psychologically, he lived inside a self-reinforcing loop that he trusted no one fully. Because he trusted no one, he relied on fear. Because he relied on fear, people planned escape. Because people planned escape, he trusted them even less. The loop fed itself, and feeds like this do not end in equilibrium. They end in collapse. What is striking about Casso's life is not how violent it became. It is how inevitable that violence grew. Once fear becomes the sole organizing principle of a person's world, every new interaction feels like a potential threat, and potential threats demand action. Over time, this turns ordinary life into a battlefield that never truly quiets. Even when nothing is happening. By the height of his power, Casso no longer needed enemies to feel under siege. The system he had built guaranteed siege as a constant condition, and that condition slowly stripped away his ability to perceive calm as anything other than danger, which meant peace itself became intolerable. This is the psychological paradox at the center of his story. That he created fear to stabilize his world, but in doing so, he made stability impossible for himself. The downfall of Anthony Casso did not begin with law enforcement. It began with a psychological error that guaranteed exposure long before any indictment was written. That he believed that fear could replace balance. For a time, it did. Fear kept mouths shut. Fear kept rivals contained. Fear kept hesitation out of decision-making. But fear has no natural limit. It does not know when enough is enough. Systems built on fear always demand escalation, because fear fades with familiarity. What terrifies today becomes tolerated tomorrow. What is tolerated tomorrow must be intensified the next day to achieve the same effect. This is how Casso became trapped in his own design. Every year required more removals. Every year required faster decisions. Every year required broader suspicion. Eventually, he was no longer responding to real danger. He was responding to the possibility of danger, and possibility has no boundaries. The fatal psychological error was not cruelty. It was overextension. He removed too many people too quickly. He destabilized trust too completely. He hollowed out his own structure until the only thing left supporting it was constant violence. Violence is powerful, but it is also noisy. And no matter how carefully executed, bodies generate questions. Absences generate attention. Disappearances generate patterns. Patterns generate investigation. Casso believed fear could erase patterns in reality. Fear made patterns more predictable. The more he relied on elimination as correction, the more uniform his responses became. And uniform responses are exactly what investigators learned to recognize. Even before the first informant defected, his system had already become too rigid to remain invisible forever. Psychologically, this was inevitable, because fear-based control leaves no room for adaptation. Every challenge becomes an existential threat. Every disagreement becomes a potential betrayal. Every uncertainty becomes a reason to destroy. This narrows perception that IT turns leadership into reflex, and reflex, by its nature, is predictable. Anthony Casso did not fall because he was weak, he fell because he made fear absolute, and absolutes cannot survive contact with reality. Reality contains variability. Reality contains contradiction. Reality contains people who eventually choose survival over obedience. Once even one person rejected his system and escaped alive, the illusion of inevitability collapsed. And once inevitability collapses, fear loses its authority. Looking back, his fate was sealed the moment possibility became punishable by death, because the only way to stop possibility is to eliminate everyone. And a system that requires infinite elimination cannot sustain itself. In the end, Anthony Casso was not undone by enemies. He was undone by the internal logic of the world he created, a world where fear solved everything, until it solved him as well. Chapter 10. The People Who Never Returned. Long before Anthony Casso became a headline, there were families living in the shadow of his decisions. Families who waited at kitchen tables long after midnight. Families who kept the porch light on for years. Families who searched for answers that never arrived. His rise to power had been built on disappearance. But disappearance is not a clean absence. It leaves a shape, a silence, a void that bends the lives around it. The victims in his world were not always men with criminal histories. Some were caught in the wrong currents of suspicion. Some were targeted for reasons that existed only inside a rumor. Some were removed simply because they had been standing near someone else's mistake. Every family processed the loss differently. Some lived in suspended hope, convinced their loved one might still return. For these families, time moved strangely. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Holidays became reminders rather than gatherings. Children grew up with a photograph instead of a father. Other families reached acceptance faster, but acceptance brought its own kind of suffering. Without a body, grief cannot settle. It circles. It returns. It asks the same questions every year. Where? How? Why? These unanswered questions shaped the rest of a life. Many of these families did not learn the truth until decades later, when Casso began talking. Some learned it through courtroom testimony. Others found it in a news article. A few heard it through investigators who finally had permission to speak openly. For some, the truth brought relief. For others, it tore wounds back open. But almost no one felt closure, because closure requires something Casso never allowed: finality with dignity. Every disappearance he ordered took more than a life. It took a future that had never been lived. It took traditions, birthdays, anniversaries, routines. It took the chance for families to say goodbye. The cost of his decisions rippled outward through generations. Children grew up without guidance. Parents aged without answers. Siblings carried invisible weight well into adulthood. Some families kept the old habits alive, setting a place at the table on holidays, preserving a room exactly as it was left, never changing the phone number just in case. Others avoided anything that reminded them of the loss. Casso never saw these families. He never met their children. He never witnessed the slow, quiet suffering that followed his decisions. Because his violence was procedural, the impact was personal. This divide between the act and its consequence is where the true human cost of his reign lives. Behind every name in his story is a life interrupted, a family reshaped, a timeline broken. And yet, for decades, these stories remained invisible, buried beneath silence, fear, and the machinery of organized crime. But silence never protects victims. It only protects the people who made them disappear. For many of the families, the worst years were not the first ones. Shock carried them through the beginning. Disbelief created movement. Searching gave them purpose. It was the years after that broke them quietly. When the searches ended, when the phone stopped ringing, when the police stopped calling, that is when uncertainty became a permanent condition of life. Some families lived in a state of suspended reality. They did not fully grieve, because grief requires certainty. Instead, they learned how to exist in a strange middle space between hope and loss. They checked strangers' faces in crowds. They listened closely to unfamiliar footsteps on the street. They kept answering machines plugged in long after most people had moved on. Others tried to force finality without evidence. They held memorials without bodies. They buried empty coffins. They told themselves the words that needed to be spoken even when proof did not exist. Both paths carried pain. Years passed. Children grew into adults without answers. Parents aged into silence. The world moved forward while these families remained anchored to a single unanswered moment. Then, slowly, the truth began to surface, not all at once but name by name, case by case, through transcripts, through testimony, through sealed documents finally opened. For some families, investigators arrived at their doors with information that had been hidden for decades. For others, they learned through news reports that mentioned their loved one casually, almost as an aside in a larger story about prosecution. This moment was not closure. It was transformation. The uncertainty that had ruled their lives for years was replaced with something heavier, knowing. Some families felt a strange relief simply from hearing confirmation that their loved one had not abandoned them, that their absence had not been a choice, that their silence had not been voluntary. Others felt anger rise in ways they had never experienced before, because uncertainty can numb pain. Truth sharpens it. For the first time, many families could attach responsibility to a name. They could say who had decided, who had ordered, who had calculated that their loved one no longer needed to exist. But knowing the truth did not return time. It did not restore childhoods that had passed without fathers. It did not heal marriages that had dissolved under unanswered strain. It did not undo years of holidays that had been endured rather than celebrated. Some families chose to speak publicly. They attended court hearings. They gave statements. They watched the man connected to their loss sit in silence as their stories entered the official record. Others chose to remain private. Both choices were acts of survival, because when the truth arrives late, it does not enter gently. It collides with everything that has grown around the absence, and every family must decide how much of that collision they can carry. For many families, the word justice never felt large enough to contain what had been lost. That a verdict did not replace a voice at the dinner table, that a sentence did not restore years that had passed in silence, that a prison cell did not give back childhoods that had ended without explanation. When Anthony Casso was convicted, some families attended the proceedings. They sat quietly behind rows of strangers and listened as legal language transformed into personal memory. Dates that once meant birthdays became dates of disappearance. Locations that once felt harmless became places of final departure. For some, there was relief in hearing the truth spoken out loud. Relief that the silence was finally broken. Relief that denial no longer ruled the narrative. Relief that their loved one's absence was acknowledged by the world. But relief did not equal peace, because the years between loss and truth had already hardwired grief into the structure of their lives. Parents had buried hope slowly. Over decades, spouses had learned to survive without resolution. Children had learned to grow up without explanation. When justice finally arrived, it landed on lives that had already been reshaped. Some families described it as standing in front of a locked door for years, only to have it open long after the need for answers had turned into a need for endurance. Others felt anger sharpen instead of dissolve. Anger at how quietly it had all happened. Anger at how long it had taken. Anger that the final truth arrived through court. Transcripts instead of safe returns. And yet, even with anger, there was a sense of finality that had been impossible before. Because disappearance traps families in uncertainty, truth, even when painful, releases them from endless imagining. Still, imprisonment rarely feels like balanced. No sentence carries equivalent weight to a missing life. A prison term counts years. A disappearance counts generations. Children raised without fathers grow into adults without memories. Parents who waited decades for answers reach old age carrying images that never moved forward. Siblings age into roles they never meant to fill. The punishment always arrives too late to meet the moment of loss, and often, it arrives too quietly to feel like compensation. Some families tried to reclaim space for memory. They built rituals that had never existed before. Memorials without bodies. Anniversaries without graves. Spoken names where silence had once dominated. Others chose distance from the story entirely. They closed folders, declined interviews, refused to let the disappearance become their identity. Both paths carried equal weight, because survival after disappearance does not follow a template. What lingered most among many families was not hatred, it was fatigue, the exhaustion that follows decades of unanswered waiting. The wear that settles into people who hold space for someone who never returns. When Casso died in prison years later, reactions were muted. Some families felt nothing at all. Some felt the faint closure of an ending finally sealed. Some felt an anger they had long stopped expecting to change. But nearly all understood the same truth. His death did not return anything that had been taken. It only confirmed that time had moved forward without the lost. And that is the heaviest truth of disappearance. Not that someone was taken, but that the world continued without them. Chapter 11. The story the world thought it knew. For most of Anthony Casso's reign, the public never truly saw him. They saw fragments. A headline here, a rumor there, a name briefly mentioned in connection with another arrest, another trial, another disappearance. But the full shape of his world remained hidden behind louder figures. The media prefers faces that performed. It follows men who boast. It chases spectacle, not structure. And Anthony Casso was not spectacled. He did not give interviews. He did not cultivate celebrity. He did not step into the light unless absolutely necessary. While the public learned names of famous mob bosses, union figures, and flamboyant criminals, Casso remained mostly invisible. Even during the height of his power, many ordinary people would not have recognized him on the street. This created a dangerous distortion. The story of organized crime became framed around personalities rather than systems. Violence was treated as eruption rather than policy. Murder was reported as conflict rather than strategy. In that version of reality, Casso faded into the background as just another name in court filings. But inside the world he shaped, he was never background. The media often reported the outcomes of his decisions without understanding the mechanism behind them. A body discovered, a defendant missing, a witness silenced. Each event treated as isolated. What rarely appeared in early coverage was the connective tissue, the pattern, the design. The public, crime appeared chaotic. Those living under Casso's authority, it was meticulously organized. This gap between appearance and architecture allowed his power to grow longer than it otherwise might have. Because chaos attracts attention, structure hides inside outcomes. When Casso was arrested, the coverage spiked. The headlines sharpened. Words like enforcer, killer, mob hitman began circulating widely. His name finally surfaced in full. But even then, the narrative struggled to capture the deeper reality. He was still described as a violent man, not as a system builder. His psychology was flattened into brutality. His strategy reduced to cruelty. His methods collapsed into individual acts of murder rather than an entire philosophy of control. The public learned that he had killed. What they did not immediately learn was how he had governed. That murder, to him, was not an expression. It was infrastructure. Journalists rushed to connect him to famous cases, to legendary disappearances, to figures already etched into popular crime history. This made his story easier to tell, but it also distorted it, because Anthony Casso was never driven by myth the way others were. He did not attempt to echo the great names of the past. He did not build power through legacy. He built it through manageability. Fear that could be scheduled, compliance that could be automated, silence that could be enforced without discussion. These things do not make dramatic headlines. They make long, quiet periods where nothing appears to happen, and nothing, in criminal reporting, is often mistaken for peace. Only after his cooperation began did the media finally start assembling the full silhouette of what had existed beneath years of disappearances. Courtrooms revealed the extent. Transcripts provided shape. Witness after witness confirmed a truth that headlines had never contained. Casso had not been reacting to crime, he had been administering it. For reporters, this created a dilemma. How do you tell the story of a man whose greatest weapon was the absence of story? How do you illustrate fear that operated without spectacle? How do you frame violence that rarely left visible warnings? The answer, most of the time, was simplification. He was turned into a monster, and monsters are easier to understand than systems. When a monster is removed, the story feels finished. When a system is exposed, the story never truly ends. This is why, even now, popular memory often treats Anthony Casso as a solitary figure of terror rather than the center of a deeper machinery that involved dozens of men, hundreds of decisions, and countless silent consequences. The media gave the world events that IT did not give the world the environment those events grew from. For years, the public was taught to recognize crime through spectacle, gunfights, public assassinations, explosive headlines. These became the symbols of danger. The markers people learned to watch for. Anthony Casso did not operate inside that language, and because of that, his power remained misunderstood. When violence is loud, it shocks. When violence is routine, it disappears into background noise. That Casso's greatest advantage was that his violence rarely demanded attention. Men vanished in ways that could be interpreted as coincidence. Conflicts ended without public confrontation. Entire chains of authority were rewritten without leaving visible damage in the street.to journalists. This looked like calm.to investigators. Once they saw the larger picture, it looked like efficiency, but efficiency does not photograph well. What the public saw were bodies. What they missed was conversion, the conversion of suspicion into death, the conversion of rumor into certainty, the conversion of internal doubt into permanent removal. Casso was never meant to be a front-facing figure. He was positioned where cameras rarely looked. While reporters focused on flamboyant crime bosses and public trials, Casso stayed in the machinery behind them. This created a myth that organized crime was driven by ego and spectacle alone. In reality, during his reign, it was increasingly driven by logistics. The media often framed murders during his era as rival conflicts, turf disputes, personal vendettas, power struggles between colorful personalities. But many of those deaths were not reactions. They were preemptions. Men were killed not because they acted. They were killed because someone believed they might act. This shift from reactive violence to predictive violence is what made Casso uniquely dangerous, and it is also what made him difficult to portray accurately in public storytelling. Predictive violence has no visible trigger. It emerges from internal calculus. It cannot be dramatized easily. So, instead, the public was given caricatured. He was described as a monster, the demon. A symbol of pure cruelty. Those labels were emotionally satisfying. They were also incomplete. Because monsters act from hunger or impulse, Casso acted from design. The myth of the monster reassured people that evil was aberrant, that it erupted from disturbed individuals rather than organized reasoning, that it could be ended by removing one bad actor. But Casso was not an eruption. That he was a regulator. He smoothed instability through annihilation. He eliminated variables through disappearance. He simplified the world by making it smaller. This kind of power is not dramatic. It is suffocating. It does not announce itself. It compresses everything around it until resistance feels pointless. The media, trained to look for conflict, missed the significance of long stretches where nothing appeared to happen. But those stretches were exactly where Casso's authority was strongest. No crimes reported, no executions found, no disputes visible. That silence was interpreted as stability. In truth, it was control. Only after his arrest did reporters begin trying to reconstruct the architecture they had never fully seen while it was operating. They traced back old disappearances, reopened cases long thought unsolvable, aligned patterns that had never been connected publicly. By then, the story had already hardened into mythology, and mythology resists correction. Because the public prefers villains who rage. It struggles to understand villains who manage. When Anthony Casso finally fell, the story told to the public felt simple. The most feared man in New York had been arrested. The violence had been exposed. Justice had arrived. But that simplicity was an illusion, because what ended with his imprisonment was not a reign. It was only a phase of a much larger system. Headlines focused on closure, on convictions, on the image of a powerful man finally contained. To the outside world, it looked like a final chapter. Inside the structure he had shaped, it felt different. What truly ended was not violence. It was a style of governance. Casso's system had not relied on charisma or loyalty. It relied purely on elimination as problem-solving. Once that approach was removed from the environment, the underworld did not collapse into peace. It adjusted to a different equilibrium. But the media framed his fall as if a monster had been removed and the threat had vanished with him. This reassured the public. It allowed the story to feel complete. In reality, the removal of one architect never erases the blueprint. It only forces others to build more quietly. What the public never fully saw was how many of the structures Casso had enforced continued to function after he was gone. The fears softened. The killings slowed. But the habits remained for years. Silence still governed disputes. Avoidance still replaced confrontation. Preemptive caution still ruled internal thinking. These behaviors did not disappear when he was taken away. They faded only as new generations entered a world that no longer carried his constant pressure. The media also misunderstood the nature of his cooperation. It was often depicted as a betrayal driven by fear of prison. That explanation was convenient. It reduced a complex psychological turn into a single motive. But Casso did not talk because he was panicking that he talked, because control had shifted into a new environment where fear no longer worked. Cooperation was not surrender. It was adaptation. Even his transformation into a witness was treated by the public as an extraordinary reversal. The feared man becoming the one who spoke. But from a structural perspective, it followed the same logic he had always used. When force no longer functions, switch tools. The media wants transformation stories to feel redemptive or tragic. The Casso's was neither. It was procedural. And this is what the public never fully absorbed. Anthony Casso was not defined by rage, that he was defined by process. Process does not leave emotional footprints. It leaves operational ones. And those are much harder to visualize. Even after his death, his story continued to circulate in simplified form. The brutal enforcer. The notorious killer. The monster behind countless murders. All of that was true, but it was not the most important truth. The most important truth was this: that he demonstrated how completely a man can turn fear into an administrative function, how smoothly violence can become management, how quietly an entire world can be governed without spectacle, and how long such a system can remain invisible precisely because it avoids noise. The headlines came and went. The myth hardened, but the deeper lesson remained beneath public memory, that the most dangerous criminal power does not roar. It regulates, and regulation, when stripped of conscience, becomes something far more enduring than terror. Chapter 12. The blind spots that let him rise. For years, Anthony Casso existed inside a space law enforcement struggled to see clearly. Not because investigators were careless, not because resources were lacking, but because his power moved through absence rather than spectacle. Police are trained to respond to noise. Visible violence. Scenes that demand action. Casso built a system designed to avoid noise completely. During the height of his power, men did not fall in crowded streets. They did not die in dramatic public confrontations. Instead, they simply failed to return home, failed to answer their phones, failed to appear at the places where they had always been. Disappearance is one of the most difficult crimes to investigate. There is no bodied, no weaponed, no confirmed crime scene, no clear moment when a law has been violated. In the early stages of Casso's rise, many of the men who vanished under his authority were quietly classified as runaways, defectors, or victims of unrelated disputes. Each assumption closed a door that should have remained open, and that allowed his structure to grow uninterrupted. Another major blind spot was the focus on visible leadership. Investigations traditionally followed the loudest names, the men who gave orders in public settings, the figures who moved crowds and attracted attention, the ones whose faces appeared repeatedly in newspapers and court documents. Casso did not operate that way. He avoided attention completely. He avoided public meetings. He avoided anything that made him memorable to outsiders. On paper, he appeared secondary for far too long. An enforcer, a facilitator, a problem solver beneath the true leaders. That misclassification delayed recognition of what he truly was. Not the blade, the hand that chose where the blade landed. Another failure came from how violence was interpreted. Most murders are investigated by first identifying motive: debt, revenge, territory, betrayal, emotional conflict. Casso's killings increasingly had no visible emotional trigger. Men were not dying because of fights. They were dying because of suspicion, because of possibility, because of preemptive calculation. This broke traditional investigative logic. When a man is killed after a dispute, motive is traceable. When a man is killed because someone thinks he might become a risk someday, motive becomes abstract. That abstraction allowed many of his crimes to remain invisible in the early years. There was also a total absence of early witnesses. Inside his organization, fear was absolute. Men did not talk. not to police, not to friends, sometimes not even to family. Fear created a perfect vacuum of information. Investigators sensed that something was wrong, but sensing is not proving. Without testimony, cases stalled. Surveillance produced fragments with no context. Wiretaps recorded coded conversations that could not yet be translated into structure. It was like listening to echoes without ever finding the original voice. Another blind spot was the illusion of stability. Under Casso, internal violence was constant, but external chaos was limited. Street-level conflicts decreased. Public shootings became rarer. Inter-family wars quieted down. The outside world. This looked like the escalation. Law enforcement. It suggested that pressure was working. In reality, it meant the terror had moved entirely inward. The streets became quieter because the violence no longer needed witnesses. Casso's system had reached a level where fear did more work than weapons. Perhaps the most dangerous blind spot of all was underestimating how long fear can function efficiently. There is a belief in criminal investigation. That fear eventually causes mistakes. That terror makes people reckless. That paranoia leads to exposure. This is often true, but Casso demonstrated something far more unsettling. Fear can also produce precision. For years, men acted carefully because they were terrified. No loose talk, no unnecessary movement, no impulsive reactions. Fear created flawless discipline, and discipline suppresses evidence. His system did not begin to crack because investigators suddenly improved. It cracked because fear eventually became too heavy to carry. Not everyone breaks under pressure at the same time. But when people do break, the collapse is sudden and irreversible. And when that finally happened, years of blind investigation suddenly flooded with clarity. But by then, the damage was already vast. The first real cracks in Anthony Casso's protection did not come from wiretaps or surveillance. They came from exhaustion. For years, fear had held the structure together perfectly. Men obeyed without protest. Silence moved faster than communication. Disappearance replaced punishment. The system appeared stable to everyone watching from the outside. But inside that stability, pressure never stopped building. Men slept with panic just beneath consciousness. Every knock at the door carried weight. Every unexpected delay felt like a warning. Every quiet conversation sounded like planning. Fear is an efficient manager, but it is also a devastating one. Investigators missed how deeply this pressure was reshaping behavior inside the organization. They underestimated the psychological toll of living under permanent threat. They believed fear created obedience forever. In reality, fear creates timers inside people. Each person eventually reaches a point where survival outweighs loyalty. That moment does not announce itself. It forms silently. It waits. And when it arrives, everything changes at once. The first man who chose survival did not walk into a police station dramatically. He did not demand protection. He did not confess everything in a single breath. He tested the waters. A quiet tip, a partial truth, a fragment of structure. This was enough to transform years of scattered investigation into something coherent. But even then, mistakes followed. One of the greatest investigative failures during this period was moving too cautiously when the first real opening appeared. Law enforcement, conditioned by decades of silence, expected traps. They feared misinformation. They worried about being manipulated. These concerns were valid, but hesitation allowed damage to continue. Instead of moving aggressively on the first internal collapse, agencies verified and re-verified while bodies continued to disappear. The instinct to avoid error delayed action at the very moment when speed mattered most. Another failure was siloed intelligence. Different agencies held different pieces of the same puzzle. One department tracked financial movement. Another tracked disappearances. Another tracked wiretap fragments. But these streams did not immediately converge. Fear did not just suppress witnesses. It also fragmented understanding. By the time information finally aligned across departments, entire chains of violence had already run their course. There was also a deep misreading of Casso himself. Even when his name began appearing more prominently in intelligence briefings, he was still often described as an executor rather than an architect. The assumption was that orders flowed from above him. This misjudgment delayed direct focus on his decision-making role. Investigators were hunting messengers. The message makers still moved freely. Another critical blind spot was the interpretation of cooperation itself. Early informants were treated as isolated cases rather than symptoms of a systemic collapse. Each defection was analyzed as an individual event instead of a signal that fear was breaking down across the organization. By the time agencies realized they were witnessing a chain reaction rather than isolated betrayal, Casso's internal world had already begun unraveling entirely. Fear delayed justice, not because investigators lacked ability, but because it created a false sense of permanence to outsiders. The organization felt frozen in its disciplined in reality it was already cracking from the inside. The tragedy of Casso's era is that by the time law enforcement saw the full picture clearly, the most devastating damage had already passed. Years of lives lost, families trapped in silence, communities shaped by disappearances that were never publicly acknowledged until much later. Fear does not only control criminals, that it bends the entire environment around it. And that bending delayed truth far longer than it ever should have. When the blind spots finally collapsed, they did not collapse slowly. They collapsed all at once. The moment a second insider came forward, investigators realized they were no longer dealing with a single fracture. They were witnessing a structural failure. Information that had once appeared unrelated suddenly aligned with terrifying precision. Financial records that had seemed abstract now carried motive. Disappearances that had once looked random now formed a sequence. Conversations that had once sounded meaningless now revealed command and response. The shape of the machine emerged, and at the center of that machine sat Anthony Casso. For years, investigators had been studying the symptoms. Now they were finally seeing the disease. What followed was a violent acceleration of truth. Witnesses who had stayed silent for decades began moving simultaneously. Some because they realized the wall of fear was no longer intact. Others because they feared being the last to speak. A few because they no longer trusted the protection of the organization they had once relied upon. Fear had flipped direction, that it no longer pointed at them, it pointed behind them. This created a cascade effect that law enforcement had never experienced at this scale within a single crime family. Names appeared faster than they could be processed. Operations collapsed midstream. Safe houses were abandoned before raids could even reach them. For the first time, Casso's system was being dismantled faster than he could respond. And yet, even in this moment of exposure, the final blind spot remained psychological. Investigators believed that once fear broke, everyone would rush to safety. What they underestimated was how deeply fear still shaped decision-making even after its authority weakened. Some men did not cooperate immediately. They fled instead. Others tried to remove loose ends. A few escalated violence in desperate attempts to regain control. This created a dangerous interim period where both collapse and chaos overlapped. Law enforcement was no longer just uncovering past crimes. They were trying to prevent new ones born from desperation. Arrests surged. Warrants multiplied. Surveillance intensified to a degree unseen in previous years. The streets felt it. The underworld felt it. Even ordinary neighborhoods felt a strange shift in air, as if something massive had tipped inside the invisible world beneath daily life. This was the moment the blind spots fully disappeared. The silence that had once protected everything became impossible to maintain. And in its place came contradiction. Men who had once enforced obedience under threat now argued in open court. Men who had once vanished without trace now had their last movements reconstructed in detail. Men who had once been untouchable suddenly stood in cuffs. The most unsettling realization for investigators was not how many crimes had gone unnoticed. It was how efficiently fear had hidden them all in plain sight. People had sensed something was wrong for years. The scale, however, had been unimaginable. The assumption had always been that violence erupted sporadically. What they found instead was an entire era shaped by silent governance. Casso did not merely evade law enforcement. He operated inside a vacuum of sound that investigators had been trained, unknowingly, not to see. The blinds did not fail because police were incapable. They failed because fear produced a version of reality that looked orderly from the outside. And order is often mistaken for safety to be why the time the final pieces locked into place. The lesson was brutally clear. The most dangerous systems are not the ones that scream. They are the ones that never need to. Chapter 13. How the Underworld Quietly Changed. After Anthony Casso's arrest and the collapse of the system he helped build, the criminal world did not simply return to the way it had been before him. It paused. And in that pause, it recalculated itself. For decades, organized crime in New York had followed a familiar rhythm. Power moved through visible hierarchies. Violence served as a threat, not a constant condition. Disputes were managed through negotiation long before they reached execution. Casso broke that rhythm completely, and once it was broken, it could never be fully restored. In the years following his fall, one of the most noticeable changes was how leaders viewed power itself. Authority was no longer something to concentrate aggressively in one place. The men who survived his era had seen exactly what happens when absolute control is paired with absolute fear. It attracts attention, it accelerates collapse, it leaves no room for error. As a result, post-Casso leadership became deliberately fragmented. Power was spread across committees instead of resting on a single figure. Decisions required broader agreement. No one man was allowed to become the final authority on life and death without oversight. Not because criminals suddenly believed in fairness, but because they understood how dangerous centralized terror had proven to be. Another shift unfolded in how violence itself was used. Under Casso, murder had become preemptive. Men were removed for what they might do, not only for what they had already done. After his removal, this logic receded. Killing returned to being reactive. Disputes were allowed to exist longer. Conflicts were allowed to simmer. Negotiation regained value, not out of mercy, but out of self-preservation. The men who remained understood that constant internal murder had weakened them far more than rivals ever had. Fear had kept everyone obedient, but it had also hollowed out trust so completely that the organization nearly destroyed itself from within. What followed was not peace, it was containment. Violence still existed, but it was rationed again. Controlled. Used only when absolutely necessary to protect money or reputation. The era of constant disappearance became something older criminals warned younger ones about with unease rather than nostalgia. Communication also changed permanently. During Casso's reign, fear demanded secrecy through silence. After him, secrecy became technical. Meetings moved less. Information traveled through fewer trusted channels. Digital methods began replacing face-to-face exchanges. Intermediaries multiplied. No one wanted to be the single point of failure ever again. Every system was designed with collapse in mind. Even recruitment shifted. Younger criminals were kept further from leadership. The distance between soldier and decision-maker widened. The fewer people who knew the full structure, the safer the structure felt. This made organized crime slower, less dramatic, harder to penetrate. Casso's era had proved that efficiency through fear creates explosive vulnerability. After him, inefficiency became a form of armor. Perhaps the most profound change was psychological. The myth of invincibility died. Casso had once appeared untouchable. His fall proved that even the most feared man in the city could be stripped of power, isolated, exposed, and forgotten. That realization reshaped ambition. After him, fewer men wanted to become legends. They wanted to become invisible survivors. Power was no longer something to display. It was something to hide inside. But even as the underworld adjusted, one truth remained unresolved. Casso had not merely changed tactics, he had changed what criminals believed was possible, and once that line is crossed, no future generation ever fully unlearns it. As the years passed after Casso's removal, the deeper effects of his era became impossible to ignore. On the surface, crime statistics appeared calmer. The sudden waves of unexplained disappearances slowed. Public violence became less frequent. To ordinary people, it felt like the worst of that darkness had receded. But beneath that calm, something different had taken root. Organized crime did not become weaker. It became more adaptive. The lesson absorbed from Casso's fall was not that brutality was dangerous. It was that visibility was dangerous. Survivors of his era began restructuring their operations to avoid the very pressure that had destroyed him. They learned to operate in smaller units. They avoided dominance over large territories. They dissolved rigid chains of command in favor of flexible networks. Power became harder to see. And what is harder to see is harder to destroy. One of the most significant changes appeared in how loyalty was handled. During Casso's reign, loyalty had been coerced through terror. After him, Fear was no longer trusted as a long-term adhesive. Leaders understood that absolute fear produces absolute instability. Instead, loyalty became transactional again. Money replaced terror as the main binding force. Benefits replaced threats. Protection replaced punishment, not because morality returned, but because terror had proven too volatile. Internal disputes were now deliberately slowed down. Decisions were postponed. Emotions were managed through delay rather than execution. Men were allowed to argue. They were allowed to make minor mistakes. Even suspicion no longer guaranteed destruction. The system had learned that removing too many people too fast creates informational collapse. Every disappearance erases not only a person, but a layer of memory. Contacts are lost. Routes become unstable. Trust dissolves completely. And when trust disappears, business cannot function effectively. Casso's era had nearly driven the organization into a state where no one could fully operate without fear of being erased. After him, stability returned not through mercy, but through controlled tolerance. Another shift occurred in the relationship with law enforcement. Before Casso, most organized crime expected pressure. After Casso, they expected long surveillance. They learned that time, not aggression, had destroyed him. Wiretaps, financial tracking, patience. The new lesson was unsettling. Law enforcement no longer needed to win quickly. They only needed to wait. Criminals adapted by moving slower. Money flows were stretched over longer periods. Profits were divided more carefully. Exposure was managed through delay rather than speed. Speed had once been power. Now, speed felt like risk. Even violence was redesigned. Hits became rarer but more carefully staged. Smaller teams, fewer witnesses, less internal knowledge. Every killing was treated as a potential future case file rather than a simple removal. No one assumed safety anymore. Every action was imagined from the perspective of future investigators. The underworld had become self-aware in a way it never had been before. This awareness did not make it harmless, it made it self-concealing. Perhaps the most haunting change was how younger generations were trained. Older men no longer taught fear as the primary lesson. They taught caution that do not speak unnecessarily, do not pursue rank aggressively, do not trust structures that elevate you too quickly, do not believe any position is permanent. Casso's story was used not as inspiration, but as a cautionary fable, a reminder of what happens when power grows faster than invisibility. His rise had shown how efficiently fear could command a city. His fall taught how completely that same efficiency invites destruction. In this way, Anthony Casso continued to influence the underworld long after his voice had gone silent, not as a ruler, but as a permanent warning embedded into the instincts of those who followed. By the time a full decade had passed after Anthony Casso's removal, the transformation of the underworld was no longer subtle, it was structural. The generation that came up under his reign carried permanent psychological scars. These were men who had learned survival in an environment where suspicion alone could mean death. Even after his fall, they did not return to normal criminal behavior. They operated as if the threat still existed. Every interaction was filtered through instinctive caution. Every alliance was temporary in their minds. Every success felt conditional. The era of blind loyalty was over. Trust, once broken at that scale, does not fully recover. What replaced it was something colder: calculation. Men no longer built empires with dreams of permanence. They built exit strategies alongside every operation. Every plan included not only profit, but disappearance routes. Every partnership assumed betrayal as a future possibility. Casso's greatest long-term impact was not how people killed, it was how they learned to leave. Younger criminals noticed this difference immediately. They grew up seeing older figures who never fully settled into positions of comfort. Leaders kept moving. Territories shifted more often. Identities became fluid. Stability was treated with suspicion that if something lasted too long, it felt dangerous. This produced a kind of organized instability that had not existed before. Crime continued. Profit continued. Violence continued. But nothing stayed still long enough to resemble the old kingdoms of the past. The old model of the American Mafia as a permanent governing shadow over neighborhoods faded even further into history. What replaced it looked smaller, more fractured, more mobile. Law enforcement, too, changed as a result. Agencies no longer expected large, centralized families to dominate entire regions. They began hunting networks instead of regimes, cells instead of hierarchies, financial nodes instead of political ones. The war shifted from personalities to patterns. This made investigations slower, but it also made them deeper. Casso's fall proved that taking one man could dismantle a terrifying structure, but it also proved that new structures would always reassemble in quieter ways. And so the pursuit became endless. The streets remembered this era differently than the underworld did. For communities scarred by disappearance, the slowing of unexplained vanishings felt like a return to breath. Families slept easier. Doors stayed unlocked longer. The constant anxiety that someone might simply never come home began to ease. Not completely, but enough to matter. That, perhaps, is the hidden line that marks the real end of Casso's reign. Not his arrest, not his conviction, not his death, but the moment disappearance stopped being expected for the men who followed him into criminal life. That expectation never fully vanished. It stayed embedded in their thinking as a permanent contingency. And that is how his influence survived, not in fear of his name, but in fear of what they had witnessed happen to an entire world built on terror. The underworld learned not how to become peaceful, but how to avoid becoming him again. Chapter 14. The Long Shadow That Never Fully Faded. Even after Anthony Casso's removal, his presence did not vanish the way so many of his victims had. It lingered, not as a man, but as an idea. Years passed. Faces changed. Leadership shifted. Entire crews disappeared into time. Yet the logic that once governed his world continued to surface in subtle ways across new criminal structures. Not openly, quietly, in the way people avoided speaking certain names, in the way meetings stayed brief and impersonal, in the way trust was rationed instead of given. His era taught criminals that fear could be engineered so completely that it replaced loyalty, ritual, and even identity. That lesson did not disappear with his death. It became part of the underground's shared memory. Young men entering that world no longer heard heroic stories of ambition and rise. They heard cautionary ones, stories about how quickly power can turn inward, how easily suspicion becomes policy, how completely silence can swallow entire bloodlines. Casso was not remembered as a legend to emulate. He was remembered as a burn mark, a point in time where everything went too far. Yet the methods he proved effective did not vanish. They migrated into new environments. Fear-based control did not disappear from organized crime. It simply became more dispersed, less centralized, less personal, no longer tied to one name or one office. Instead of one man ruling through terror, fear became embedded into systems themselves. Automatic consequences, unwritten rules, invisible lines that could not be crossed. No one needed to issue constant threats anymore. The memory of what had once happened was enough. This is how fear becomes generational, not because it is refreshed through violence every day, but because it is taught. In habits. In pauses. In what is not said out loud. Casso's shadow was no longer a figure standing behind people. It was a presence inside decision-making. Men learned to eliminate risk early, but not through mass disappearance anymore. They did it through distancing, exile, financial suffocation, social isolation, reputation erasure. Violence became the last step again, not the first. The new underworld still punished, but it learned to punish in ways that did not invite the same scrutiny that had destroyed him. This made fear quieter, more surgical, and in many ways, more difficult to track. Law enforcement noticed the change. Cases became harder to map. Witnesses took longer to surface. Networks dissolved before full structures could be uncovered. Power moved too fluidly to remain pinned to one center. Casso's era had shown what happens when fear becomes too visible. The future learned to hide fear in motion. Perhaps the most disturbing part of his shadow was how far beyond crime it extended. Because the logic he embodied does not belong only to criminals. It appears anywhere power feels threatened. Eliminate uncertainty. Remove risk early. Control through silence. These instincts exist far beyond the underworld that Casso's life simply demonstrated. What happens when those instincts are unrestrained by consequence? And because the instincts themselves never disappear, his shadow does not either. It only changes shape. As time pushed forward, Anthony Casso's shadow stopped being attached to crime families alone. It moved into behavior. You could no longer point to a single crew and say, that is his influence. Instead, his influence appeared in how men hesitated before speaking, in how alliances were formed with expiration dates already built in how silence became the default setting for survival. Casso had taught an entire underworld that information itself could be fatal. After him, words became liabilities. People spoke in half-sentences. Meaning was hidden inside implication. Conversations avoided clarity. This created a new kind of criminal culture. One that valued ambiguity over authority. One that preferred disconnection over loyalty. Under his rule, obedience had been immediate. After his fall, hesitation became permanent. Men no longer rushed to prove themselves. They delayed. They waited. They watched. They built layers between themselves and consequence. Younger generations entering the world inherited this behavior without experiencing its origin. To them, extreme caution felt normal. Silence felt natural. Distrust felt like intelligence. They did not need to know Casso's name to live inside the environment he had shaped. Fear had already been coded into the system. One of the most profound changes was in how betrayal was understood. Before Casso, betrayal was considered a sin against loyalty. After him, betrayal became a calculated exit strategy, not emotional, not impulsive, not dramatic. Survival replaced honor as the ultimate currency. This shift created a world where no alliance ever felt permanent. Men worked together knowing that no bond was indestructible. Every partnership included the silent knowledge that cooperation could someday invert into testimony. Paranoia no longer felt like weakness. It felt prudent. That Casso's reign had trained an entire generation that the worst danger does not arrive with warning. It arrives quietly. Inside routine. Inside normal days. Inside familiar voices. That lesson became instinct, and instinct does not fade easily. Even law enforcement felt the long shadow. Investigators found that cases took longer to develop. Informants were harder to cultivate. Networks broke apart faster than they could be mapped. Every successful operation seemed to dissolve into new shapes almost immediately. Casso had accelerated the criminal world's understanding of adaptation. He had shown what happens when a system becomes too rigid. His shadow taught the future to become fluid. Ironically, the man who ruled through absolute control ended up teaching the world how to avoid absolute control forever. The most unsettling part of his shadow is this: he did not just demonstrate that fear works, he demonstrated exactly how far. Fear can go before it destroys the hand that wields it. And because that lesson was learned through blood and disappearance, it burned itself into collective memory far more deeply than any law ever could. His name did not become sacred. It became instructional, not a reference point for collapse, that a caution deeply embedded into behavior, but a story whispered without needing to be told. Anthony Casso no longer needed to be remembered for his shadow to remain active, because the world he shaped learned how to remember him without saying his name. With enough time, even the most violent eras begin to feel distant. New faces take the place of old ones. New conflicts replace forgotten wars. New names rise where old names once ruled. But Anthony Casso's shadow did not fade in the way most criminal legacies do. It did not dissolve into myth. It did not soften into legend. It did not become romanticized. It remained uncomfortable. The men who had lived through his reign carried the memory not as a story, but as a warning embedded into instinct. They did not speak about him because speaking felt unnecessary. The lesson had already been absorbed at a level deeper than memory. Fear had taught them without requiring repetition. What made his shadow different from others before him was not its size. It was its shape. Most violent leaders leave behind imitators. Casso left behind avoiders. Men did not try to become him. They tried to avoid becoming what he became. They avoided centralizing power too tightly. They avoided allowing suspicion to become policy. They avoided building systems that required constant internal killing to survive. In this way, the most feared man in New York shaped the future not through influence, but through rejection. And yet, something of him always survived: the silence, the calculation, the assumption that safety is temporary. These traits outlived him. They became features of the environment. Even criminals who had never met anyone from his inner circle still behaved as if a force like him could exist again at any time. They moved as if disappearance was always one decision away. That is the deepest form of fear, not the fear of a person, but the fear of a possibility. In this sense, Anthony Casso never fully left the criminal world. He became part of its weather, something you feel without seeing, something you adjust to without naming, something you plan around without fully understanding why. And that is why his shadow never entirely faded, because it no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to the psychology of the environment he reshaped. He proved that fear could be turned into administration, that disappearance could replace negotiation, that power could operate without noise. And once those truths were revealed, they could never be unseen. The difference is this: the world learned not to repeat him directly, it learned to disperse what he represented. Smaller systems of control, shorter chains of command, rotating leadership, layered responsibility. Fear was no longer concentrated in one hand. It was distributed. This made it harder to challenge, harder to expose, harder to dismantle. And yet, despite all of this, one outcome remained unavoidable. Fear, no matter how carefully hidden, still collapses eventually. It always does, because fear generates pressure faster than it generates loyalty. And pressure always seeks release. Anthony Casso's shadow endured not because it was immortal, but because the lesson of his collapse was absorbed more deeply than the example of his rise. His world proved that fear can rule, but it also proved that fear can never rest, and a power that cannot rest will always exhaust itself. Chapter 15. What remains when fear is gone? Anthony Casso did not build monuments that he did not leave behind speeches, creeds, or written rules that others could study. What he left behind was a pattern of consequence. For a time, his world looked orderly. Money moved efficiently. Decisions were fast. Disputes vanished instead of spreading. To those inside the structure, this felt like control in its purest form. But the truth beneath that order was always brittle, because fear does not create stability. It only borrows time from collapse. Casso ruled a world where silence was not chosen, but enforced, where loyalty was not earned, but extracted, where survival depended not on trust, but on staying unnoticed. For years, this worked too well, and that is what made it fatal. Every system built on fear eventually runs into the same problem. It must keep escalating to maintain the same level of control. What once terrified becomes familiar. What becomes familiar stops working. And what stops working gets intensified. Suspicion becomes enough. Association becomes enough. Possibility becomes enough. Under that logic, no one is ever fully safe. Not even the man issuing the orders. By the end of his reign, Anthony Casso lived inside the same condition he had forced upon everyone else: permanent alertness, permanent distrust, permanent contingency. The cage he built for others slowly closed around him too. His arrest did not just remove a criminal from the streets. It collapsed an entire philosophy of power, the idea that terror could be made permanent, that silence could be maintained forever, that obedience could be extracted without decay. His fall proved something older and more fundamental: that power which depends solely on fear has no internal repair system. When it cracks, it does not bend. It shatters. And when it shatters, everyone inside it is cut. Not just the rulers, not just the soldiers, but the families, the neighborhoods, the next generation born into the wreckage. By the time Anthony Casso died in prison, his power had already been gone for years. Not weakened, erased. No1 waited for his word. No1 feared retaliation in his name. No1 measured decisions against his approval. The most feared man in New York faded into administrative memory, an inmate number, at a medical chart, a death recorded without spectacle. That is the final contradiction of his life: a man who ruled through the loudest form of control imaginable exited the world in total quiet. No crowd, no confrontation, no final declaration. Just absence. And in that absence, a truth became clear. Fear can dominate environments, but it cannot outlive relevance. Once fear stops producing outcomes, it evaporates faster than loyalty ever would, and relevance, once lost, never returns. What ultimately defines Anthony Casso is not how many people he controlled. It is how completely his control failed to survive him. True power leaves something behind that continues to move when the original hand is gone. Laws do that. Traditions do that. Even loyalty can do that when it is earned rather than forced. Fear cannot. Fear requires constant feeding that it must be refreshed, reasserted, demonstrated again and again. The moment that process stops, fear begins to decay, and decay is exactly what swallowed Casso's world. Once he was removed, there was no belief left to sustain his authority. There was no vision anyone wanted to protect. There was no future attached to his name. What remained was only memory, and memory, when unaccompanied by consequence, loses its power. For the men who had once carried out his orders, the end came differently for each of them. Some were imprisoned, some disappeared themselves, some tried to rebuild quieter criminal lives, some vanished into ordinary anonymity. None of them carried forward a version of his world, because no one wanted to live inside it again. For law enforcement, his life became a case study in something rarely acknowledged. Publicly, that organized crime is not always driven by greed or ego. Sometimes it is driven by administrative fear, and when fear becomes administrative, it no longer looks violent on the surface. That it looks orderly, that it looks efficient, and that makes it far more dangerous. Casso taught investigators that the loudest criminals are not always the most powerful. Sometimes the most powerful man is the one whose name is barely spoken at all, the one who never needs to raise his voice, the one who never appears in public chaos, the one whose work is done before anyone realizes a decision was made. That lesson reshaped how organized crime is watched even today, not as a parade of personalities, but as a flow of decisions. For the families who lost people to his system, the question of meaning never found a clean answer. Some decided that the only meaning was survival. Some found meaning in speaking out. Some chose silence as a way to protect what remained of their peace. There was no universal resolution. Because disappearance does not resolve the way death with ceremony does. It does not begin cleanly. It does not end cleanly. It lingers. Even now, decades later, some families still live with shadows instead of memories. That is a legacy no trial and no sentence can erase. And yet, time continues to press forward. Children grow up who never knew the fear directly. Neighborhoods change. Streets that once carried tension now carry ordinary noise. Life, persistent and indifferent, continues to rebuild over absence. Anthony Casso's reign ended because fear eventually exhausted its own usefulness. The people under it learned to survive it. The people damaged by it learned to live with it. The system built from it learned to dismantle it. And when all of that was done, there was nothing left for fear to hold on to. In the end, Anthony Casso's story does not conclude with a gunshot, a final confrontation, or a dramatic last stand. It ends with quiet. That a man once feared across an entire city spent his final years confined to routine. Meals at fixed hours, lights on and off by schedule. Movement controlled by voices that no longer cared who he had once been. No decisions, no authority, no reach. Only time. And that is the final truth beneath everything he built. Fear can seize power. Fear can accelerate obedience. Fear can silence entire worlds. But fear cannot stop time. Time erodes relevance. Time dismantles control. Time strips meaning from reputation. In the end, Anthony Casso was not defeated by a rival. He was not destroyed by a war. He was not undone by a single informant. He was undone by the slow, unstoppable return of powerlessness, the same powerlessness he had spent his life inflicting on others. That is not irony. That is consequence. For those who survived his era, the memory remains complicated, not as legend, not as myth, but as a reminder of how fragile order becomes when it is built on terror instead of trust. For the families who lost people to his decisions, the wound did not heal when he fell. It adapted. It quieted. It learned to live beside ordinary life. Absence became a permanent companion. And for the world that watched from a distance, his story quietly left behind one enduring lesson. That the most dangerous power is not the one that announces itself with noise. It is the one that operates so efficiently in silence that entire lives disappear before anyone realizes a decision was ever made. Anthony Casso ruled without shouting. He destroyed without spectacle. And he vanished without ceremony. Not as a monster in the end, not as a legend, but as a man whose power could not follow him into irrelevance. And when fear finally lost its voice, the world did what it always does. That IT moved forward. Quietly, indifferently, completely.